It is our philosopher who is still making plans. France is in agony, her subjects are immolated, our pompous doctors, to lose us forever, want a republic, the grave of good Frenchmen. Strike, strike your breast, finally open your eyes. It is the most foul doctrine that makes you so unhappy. Come see a people of brothers professing the same faith, singing like our fathers, long live the church and the king. Finally, God abandons them, these men, feeble mortals, all robbers of the crown, destroyers of our altars. Long live the king, the nobles, the clergy, our French. And let us all live in joy and never be divided. Let us go forth, despite all the envious. The citadel is open. We will be victorious. But if the enemy advances, we will make our moves. We will all be heroes of the 8th Regiment. Let us all face the artillery, the entire regiment. Let's not fear the infantry. Run straight at the cannoners. Soldier, watch the bomb, which must burst on you. And at the moment it falls, let us all cry, long live the king. So went a popular song of the Vendean Catholic and Royal Army, the most tenacious opponents of the French Revolution. Have you, people watching, heard of the war in the Vendee? One of the worst atrocities in European history, comparable to those of the Second World War, a bloody stain on the French Revolution's ledger that far exceeds the more famous Terror in death count, and unlike the Terror, there was an absence even of summary justice. When Louis XVI cried out at his execution, "I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France," he couldn't have been more tragically mistaken about the fate of the Loyalists to his memory and to his monarchy. The historiography of this event has trended towards a description of genocide, a Franco-French genocide, thanks largely to one historian, Reynald Secher, who wrote, "While all the provinces become départements, the Vendée is the only department that has become a province. With a vigorous gesture, it upset the official geography of France, breaking the narrow limits that has been imposed on it. It moved on the banks of the Loire. It took a piece of the Doux Sèvres that it liked, and seized a part of Anjou, all at top speed in a few days for good. For the whole world it had become a sister of Poland and of Ireland. This painful birth took place to the sound of the parish bells and the rolling of drums, the singing of hymns in the north and La Marseillaise to the south. Thus, from its birth, it had a reputation of being warlike and heroic, the Vendée. Warlike and heroic it certainly was, but with such simplicity that though armed, it remained a peasant society. Secher's so-called Franco-French genocide, the title of his PhD, was deliberately provocative and was seeking to broaden the semantics of genocide, the intentional putting to death of an entire nation or community, in the context of what has otherwise been described as a civil war in France or an insurrection in the region of the Vendée. Secher's argument, referencing Ireland, to me at least, draws an allusion to a religious and political rather than an ethnic distinction to the ruling English. Indeed, the Vendean people here arise in accordance with Churchill's famous plea to the Irish during the Second World War to join that war and become a nation once again. A nation conceived in blood and heroism, as with the Australians at Gallipoli. What substantiates this claim is both the attempt by the Republicans, the quote-unquote patriots or the blues, to denigrate their enemies as the Vendeans, i.e. backward regionalists, and the extreme methods waged by the Republic against the civilian population, a brutal counterinsurgency resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Secher provides receipts for a slew of incriminating pieces of evidence, variations on a theme of the Vendée must be destroyed, thereby justifying a premeditated intention. However, despite Secher's rather compelling claims, and I suggest you seek out his book cited in the description, claims which I believe have rightly shifted the historical consensus away from Republican apologetics, I don't accept this claim of genocide. The weakness of this argument lies in separating the war in the Vendée from the broader Catholic Royalist campaign against the Republic and later against the Emperor Napoleon, a conflict wherein the Republicans' principal enemy was the cleric, the king, and by extension, the foreign coalition, which enabled the Republicans to present themselves as the patriots. The peasantry of the Vendée, fighting a guerrilla war against a regime placed in an existential struggle, were perceived by that regime as a treasonous cohort, rightly or wrongly. Ironically, the argument of genocide must concede that these disgruntled regionalists was in fact a correct term, the correct term given to the Vendéans by the Republicans as a pejorative, and that these Vendéans had no concern for effecting change throughout the rest of France, as they had effectively been separated from the body of France. Instead, these Vendéans ought to be content with local concessions, which even the National Convention didn't believe. So when I ask the question, did the Royalists win? I am intentionally broadening the scope of this topic to include the Chouannerie, the émigrés' interventions, the conservative concessions made under Napoleon, and the Bourbon Restoration. Secher does much to emphasize the local roots of the conflict, a conflict in which the so-called refractory clergy play a major role, downplaying the role of royalism in general. Victory for the Vendéans certainly did not represent a restoration of the ancien regime as it was configured on the eve of the revolution, but a restoration of the Catholic Church. This leads to Secher's weakest claim, that the Vendéans were in fact loyal to Napoleon until the War of the Sixth Coalition. Historian Michael Burrows has made the convincing argument that the Napoleonic Empire was more secure in Italy and in Germany than in the west and the south of France. However, Howard Payne, the historian, notes in his article cited in the description that even the emissaries of Louis XVIII were shocked by the ultra-royalism of the Vendéans, which far exceeded that of the king himself. But if this opposition to the Republic was more Catholic than Royalist, to what extent did Napoleon effectively break the association between Catholics and Royalists? Moreover, a subtle theme I'll present here are the opportunities between the opponents presented to the opponents of the revolution, a chance not to claw back a sense of what was lost, i.e. a simple, strict restoration, but an attempt to rejuvenate the Royalist cause over and above a perception of an atrophied ancien regime. And I'm very lucky to be joined in this conversation by Rupert Auguste. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me back. Very good topic.
No, thank you for coming on. So after having sort of gone through my introductory comments, I suppose, I guess, how would you interpret these events more broadly, and what is your overall interest in them? What sort of draws you to this topic?
I've kind of gone down several rabbit holes, I suppose, over time of general anti-revolutionary movements. And so obviously the War on the Vendée came up as one of them, and then that spreads into the other wider anti-revolutionary royalist movement, which was quite substantially more significant than just the War on the Vendée itself. But obviously the Vendée seems to have done the lion's share of the bleeding, as it were, for the cause, and so it is kind of more of a emotive subject, despite, as we'll probably get into, not necessarily being the most effective, but definitely the most dramatic.
Well, I think that comes to an important issue regarding semantics, which is, even conceiving of this stream, I wouldn't have chosen the title The War in the Vendée, but again, that is the parlance that is used in order to communicate this idea. As I was emphasizing, I would try and present this as part of a broader struggle between royalism and the Catholics and the various regimes inhabiting France after the revolution. And indeed, as we're going to see, the whole idea of the War in the Vendée, it is a consequence of the way that a lot of French historians have dealt with the historiography. Of course, it comes from what I refer to as this perception by the National Convention that is simply a regional problem. It's not some existential crisis that the regime really has to deal with. In the same way, for example, that Americans today perceive of Southerners and rednecks. I'm not sort of exaggerating it in terms of communicating this in terms of the progressive cosmopolitan center and these socially conservative regressive archetypes. I think if you're going to actually look at the distinction, that sort of distinction, that example of its sort of early But again, in terms of having gone over this topic of the French Revolution many, many times, we'll not know the very basic chronology of what essentially happens. Well, before 1789, France is a quote-unquote absolute monarchy, albeit under the king, Louis XVI. It loses a great degree of confidence. It's embroiled in various crises. One in particular is a financial crisis. There was an attempt at reforming the monarchy using various methods. These methods fail. The king launches a radical measure to bring forward an institution called the Estates General to sort out this fiscal crisis for the monarchy. And this leads into a situation where a part of that constituent assembly, the third estate, representing everyone who isn't part of the clergy or part of the nobility, assumes power to themselves to form a new constitution for France as a national assembly, when it looks like the king is going to lead a counter-revolution against this force. It leads to a popular insurrection in Paris, which leads to the storming of the Bastille, which is why the French, for some reason, celebrate the 14th of July every year. But through a series of stages, we have an attempt to reconcile the king more or less forcefully to this new regime. The king is removed from his palace at Versailles and brought to the Tuileries off the back of a popular revolution. The king is made to sign a very controversial document called the Constitution of the Civic Constitution of the Clergy in France, which will form a significant part of the conversation around the local origins, the conflict in the Vendée in particular, because it deals with the Catholic Church and its relationship to the papacy versus its loyalty effectively to France. There is the flight to Varennes, where the king attempts to escape to a border fortress along the Austrian Netherlands. It causes a major crisis in confidence for the longevity of a constitutional monarchy if the king himself is perceived to be a traitor. Part of this sort of concern that the king is in fact a traitor to France leads to the revolutionaries becoming more radical and wanting a war with other major European powers so as to effectively claim the king. They declare war on Austria in 1792, which happens to be, again, the ruling dynasty of the Habsburgs, into which he's married, the family of Marie Antoinette. This war at the beginning goes very badly. The French state is invaded alongside an army of emigres under the overall command of the Duke of Brunswick, issues a manifesto. The manifesto effectively declares that no harm will come to the royal family. In turn, that leads to another insurrection, which leads to the storming of the Tuileries Palace. The king and his family are placed at the mercy of the National Convention, and ultimately the National Convention will decide to vote on his execution, and the king is executed in 1793, just a few months before we have the beginning of the quote-unquote insurrection in the Vendée. Before I continue, would you like to add anything to me, trying to be as brief as possible in terms of introducing this topic?
Yeah, well, as insofar as it links to the Vendée, it's interesting to note that a couple of the major players, who, especially the aristocrats, who go on to lead the rebellion in the Vendée, were actually involved in the defense of the Tuileries Palace. So in particular, Henri de la Rochecquelin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's one of the more famous ones. And I'm sure anyone who's even had a cursory look into the topic will probably have seen his portrait and heard his famous quote.
Yes, for reference, his portrait is included on the second to the bottom left here. Yes, and this is just a map sort of showing the situation regarding the so-called refractory clergy and agreeing to oblige by this new civil constitution of the clergy. But in terms of the immediate causes and implications, Alphonse Aulard is just one of the many, many historians who've dealt with this topic. I'll be referencing a far more famous historian later on, Jules Michelet, perhaps the most famous French historian of the 19th century. But in Aulard's The French Revolution, he says this of the rising in the West. The Vendéan, the Breton, and the Angevin peasantry did not at first rise in support of royalty, but in support of their clergy and against military service. Strongly attached to their priests, they were opposed on general grounds the application of the civil constitution of the clergy, and had attended the masses of non-juring priests at farmhouses, in chapel, or in the forests. Between March the 10th and the 15th, a rising took place to cries of "Pas de milicie," i.e., no to the militia, or no militia, no enlistment, and almost immediately there was a cry for their former priests. It was these priests who stirred the peasantry to anger and presided over the first acts of civil warfare and the massacre of republicans. Now, I read that because that is very much the conventional take, which tends to, again, deal with this situation, the Vendeans, as nothing more than a reactionary nuisance. It's actually quite remarkable how so much historiography so actively demonizes the participants in terms of the war in the Vendée, which again is where we get the terminology from. But notice the massacres against the republics, the stirring up of these priests, basically seeing the priests as agitators. This forms a large bedrock for the propaganda mill waged by the National Convention, which is the new government in France, directed against the organizations that we see in the West. But what I find very interesting about this whole notion being a regional struggle, i.e. a regional struggle of, you can say, the Catholic and later Royalist coalescing forces, not just, of course, you see in the Western France, but throughout France, is that it brings up many, you can say, issues or contradictions regarding the absolute monarchy in France. The absolute monarchy in France had been attempting to centralize control for at least 200 years, really since the end of a period of French history in the 16th century known as the 100 Years' War. Everything was emphasized on the Parisian center. And so the irony is that in capturing France and capturing the king, the revolutionaries were basically usurping that great Parisian center. And as someone like Alexis de Tocqueville will write several decades after the French Revolution, that in many ways, as with the civil constitution of the clergy, the revolutionaries were actually continuing on in the legacy of absolutism. They weren't seeking to negate it. They were seeking to impose a centralized vision of a Parisian society upon the entirety of France, which is why they abolished the governments and the Parlement, or the Generalité, and they instead imposed département based on no sort of historical criteria other than naturalistic affectations and features. And this, again, is all very, very significant, because if the entire absolute monarchy, again, is to be focused on this notion of centralization, and as with Gallicanism, that the civic constitution of the clergy, in affirming the loyalty of religion of the priests and a couple of the bishops to France above all else, this again would seem to be one of, you can say, the great aspirations of Louis XIV a century before. And so when the great Catholic and the great ultimately Royalist insurrection, and many of the Republican and in particular Girondists, i.e. anti-Jacobin, who emerge as the main political force during the terror of 1793, 1794 emerge, they present themselves as regionalists. So it really becomes a revolt of the regions against this legacy of centralization, now that the centralizing tendency has basically, as I said, been usurped by the revolutionaries, and the monarchy after 1793 again is going to be forced into exile. But Rupert, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, you already mainly mostly covered it, but yeah, one of the long-running aspirations of the absolutist monarchs, the absolutist French monarchs, have been to establish one parlement over all of France, essentially. Usually that would most logically be the establishing the Paris Parlement over everything, and rather than having to deal with various parlements and all their separate law codes and legal jurisdictions, and especially duties regimes that caused all sorts of problems all over the place. There's a couple of interesting ironies about that. For one thing, it contrasts quite sharply in a way against England and later Britain, who sort of take that for granted. So it's kind of interesting that in that sense of centralization, Britain had been enjoying a greater degree of centralization, at least in that respect, that the French quote-unquote absolutist kings had aspired to for a long time. I have more to say about that potentially, but it's probably a topic for another day.
Well, I mean, just to emphasize, actually, in terms of continuing on this legacy of centralization, is not simply that the French government want to extend the boundaries of the Paris Parliament. In many cases, they would want to abolish it completely, because not just the Paris Parliament, but the various parliaments that we see on the peripheries of the French kingdom were more or less becoming hereditary offices held by various local notables, and they were becoming incredibly rebellious in terms of ratifying the various laws that were being imposed by the monarchy. The monarchy, especially when we come to a figure like Maurepas and the end of the reign of Louis XV, forced through edicts through a process called lit de justice, whereby a parliament was seen as nothing other than ratifying royal edicts, whereas having a national parliament would, like we see in England, yes, it would mean that there was one, you can say, national sort of body for the ratification and implementation of royal edicts, yet at the same time, it would provide a nexus for opposition, which is exactly what happens when the Estates General is summoned. Within a few weeks, it forms itself as a constituent assembly for the creation of a new constitution, which effectively is what occurs. But what I was really alluding to, yeah, sorry.
Can I just add a couple more other points? Is there's another curious point. Well, there's two more curious points. So one of which is the very early stages of the revolution. It's kind of not entirely clear what form it's going to take, and so you get some interesting figures like one Armand Toffin de la Rouerie, Marquis de la Rouerie, and he's an interesting figure because he starts out as a pro-revolutionary figure when his understanding of it is that it's more so taking power away from the king and returning it to the regions in a more sort of traditional way. So he comes across kind of more as a traditionalist, and then when it becomes evident, when more news starts coming out of Paris about what form it's actually going to take, he flips quite hard onto the counter-revolutionary side and is one of the founding members of the Breton Association that later becomes the Chouans and the Chouannerie. And one other point that's very interesting, especially in light of this map, as I understand it, part of the reason why the Comte d'Artois, who is one of the more reactionary figures, especially in court and in the royal family, so he goes to Turin in Piedmont, Sardinia, which is obviously just over the border of the southeast there, over the border from Provence. And while he did have family there, so that's one obvious reason to go. The other is, according to my understanding, that was where he believed the strongest pro-royalist forces would take place. So in light of the fact that it becomes one of the most densely conformist regions to the, what's it called, the state edicts, essentially, in terms of the priesthood, it's quite curious in that regard. And as I understand it, obviously the counter-revolution didn't exactly center on Provence and sort of that whole region in the southeast. And part of that is because they basically quickly descended into hunting for Huguenots and various Protestants and non-Catholics. And after that, they sort of didn't really have much interest in pursuing much beyond that.
Well, this map only tells us part of the story. It tells us essentially why there would be a proclivity towards the Vendee in Brittany, as you can see on this map on the left, for becoming so attached to their non-juring priests. But as for the region you see around Toulon, Grenoble, Lyon, this instead becomes the heart of the quote-unquote federalist revolt. And of course, Toulon will open up their port to the English, and that'll again form a backdrop to Napoleon's own, inexorable career rise as well. And many of these quote-unquote juring priests would end up recanting and deciding to rededicate themselves towards loyalty to the Pope above loyalty to the Republican Constitution, especially when after 1793, Catholicism is basically made illegal throughout France as it goes through an intensive wave of trying to deconsecrate the churches in France, turning them into temples of reason and temples and cults of the supreme being and various other elusive and esoteric sort of post-Catholic religious cults that we see during the period of the Directory as well. But I just wanted to sort of bring up a few things, which is that as there had been a Gallican tendency of the French monarchy, and a Gallican tendency was actually now running amok under the revolutionary government, that already by looking to the non-juror priests and looking to a legacy of being Catholic first and appealing to the Pope over that of the state, there's already, you can say, a kernel, you can say, of friction in terms of actually repudiating part of the legacy of the Ancien regime, as is the case with the quote-unquote abolition of feudalism. Shortly following the storming the Bastille, there are the August decrees, wherein a whole sort of raft of proposals are basically forced through, and very, in terms of actually stated proposals and actually what changes, it varies significantly. But one of these basically is on dispossessing many of the nobility in France and basically reappropriating that land and giving them to the bourgeoisie, especially in the region of the Vendée, albeit there were relatively weak links towards a more extensive and formalized system of feudalism. When we really understand feudalism, you could say real French feudalism had been seriously undermined in the 17th century. And so what we're really doing is we're dealing with the dregs of feudalism towards the end of the 18th century. But perhaps far more significant, you can say, than attacking the property of the nobility, which forces many of them to become emigres. You've already referenced to Comte d'Artois. The Duke of Provence and the Comte d'Artois were the younger brothers of King Louis XVI. Louis XVI is basically already a captive king, as we see in Paris, but already most of his relatives and a lot of the high-ranking nobility and the clergy have already gone into exile, and they're going to exile through various places in Europe. But among the notables who choose to stay, like the Bishop de Talleyrand of Autun in Burgundy, they lead the cause for the nationalization of church property, the nationalization of the monks and the monasteries, and basically liberating nunneries and monks is how they basically present it. And that, again, the attack on church property would actually be consistent with Gallican and nationalist principles, will put it at odds, you can say, with a population which considers itself to be Christian Catholic first before it is effectively French, which again is why, in terms of these regional identities, it very much seems that a huge aspect of the French Revolution is imposing, again, a top-down notion of French identity upon the provinces. And really looking back into many of the conversations I've had on this channel, especially regarding the legacy of Louis XIV, I've always looked at the legacy of the Catholic League, i.e. the Catholics who were opposed to the French monarchy in the 16th century, like the followers of the Duke of Guise. In the 17th century, this faction then became the quote-unquote devout or devout faction under Archbishop Fenelon. And these, again, figures were very interested in terms of reforming the legacy of the French monarchy, making it explicitly less Gallican and more Catholic in a universalist sense. And again, I bring this up in terms of, we talk about, what does a royalist victory here mean? Or do we even refer to this as royalist in terms of strict factions? All of these victory states and the intentions of the various populations involved in these generalized uprisings against the French revolutionary government want to achieve various things. But I want to return to the Vendee, and in particular refer back to Reynald Secher, and in particular his book, A French Genocide, the Vendee. And this is talking about the effects of the constitution and of the fact that the clergy were forced to swear an oath to this new clerical constitution in France and how it affected the population of Vendee. On January the 25th, so this was in 1791, in a letter to the Minister of the Interior of the Department of the Loire Inférieure, there was an admission of failure from the department. Until now, we had hoped to be able to maintain tranquility, but we see now that the oath to be taken up by priests and the refusal of a large number of them to do so has stirred up the populace of the countryside. We have not yet experienced any excesses, but gatherings have been noticed, which might become dangerous if we did not have a police force able to hold them at check. The departments had a reason to be worried, these being the new, more centralized, not even really provinces, but subjects of the French government in Paris. Among the 1,058 priests and monks in the Diocese of Nantes in 1791, so this is on the mouth of the River Loire in the west, only 159 took the oath. About 60 of them monks, and a certain number of them would later retract. That's what I mean in terms of what we look at this map, and it doesn't really indicate, you can say, the numbers who will remain adamant, you can say, in terms of their professed loyalty to the French Revolution. I mean, very few of them would ultimately prove to be loyal because of how radical the French Revolution became. In Vendée, there were 207 out of 768, and in insurgent Anjou, 44 out of 332. This refractory clergy, i.e. the clergy not taking the oath, was summoned to the departmental capitals in the course of January 1791 on the 4th to Nantes. In this case, too, there was a massive refusal. The rebels were considered to have resigned, i.e. resigned their positions as priests. The decree of November the 29th the previous year prescribed that no one may preach in any church without first having established his taking of this oath. Events came to a head among the bishops. The constitutional bishops were elected. Servant for Luçon, Jalais, became the curate of Cheny, Fenelon, and Mercy for Nantes. What authorities could these prelates not recognized by the Pope hold? They almost immediately resigned and were replaced by Roderick, the curate of Fougères. A prior immediately succeeded by one Mestadier, who was consecrated in Bordeaux, and one Minet, the son of a master surgeon who had been ordained a priest in 1770 and was a Parisian by adoption. Minet was supposed to be consecrated in Nantes on April the 10th by Goebel, the constitutional archbishop of Paris, and this caused an uproar. The priest composed a letter and printed tens of thousands of copies, which were distributed throughout the diocese. Your election is void. Your consecration is illicit. When you see coming to welcome you the municipal authorities in uniform, the administrative bodies, the National Guard, when you hear the bells of your cathedral ring and the cannon roar, you will simply believe that you are wished for by the town and the whole diocese, but your illusion will end perhaps when the sound of bells, the roar of the cannons and the compliments, because the majority of the clergy of the town and country will look upon you as usurper, and that will be no small matter for what is done to receive you well. Again, the whole perception that a whole raft of the clergy, significant numbers, anywhere between 15 to 20% effectively of the clergy remaining loyal, and the rest of that being 85% to 80% of the clergy throughout these regions effectively being cast out and replaced by what were effectively perceived to be political appointees as priests loyal to the legacy of the French Revolution. So now we come to the effect that this departure of the refractory clergy had. On April the 27th, 1792, one Mayor Aulard openly expressed his distress at the departure of the refractory clergy. When our curate was ready to leave, we all went to the parsonage to collect the registers of baptisms and weddings and deposited them in a closet in the sacristy, for which we have a key. Now, gentlemen, we need to know what course of conduct to adopt in this matter. When there is a funeral to be held in our parish, what does happen? Which does happen? What priest shall we ask for baptisms, and who will record them? Farewells to priests were sometimes moving, as in Saint-Hilaire-de-Montaigne. Before leaving, the curate, Matthew Payne, summoned his parishioners for the last time, and after making pious recommendations, he said this to them: "Wherever Providence may lead me, I will pray for you. My heart and my spirit will be with you. Every Sunday, if I am able, I will offer the holy sacrifice to God for all the inhabitants of this parish. And if, as I unfortunately fear, you are prevented from hearing Mass from a good priest, I urge you to meet as often as you can every Sunday in the church, at the time when I have always been accustomed to say it with you. At that hour, that is around 10 o'clock, I will go up to the holy altar and will celebrate it with you. You will join your prayer to mine, and I have no doubt that the good Lord will take account of the intention. You will have to follow the precepts. Do not go to a Mass held by any intruder." To widespread astonishment, the church remained open, and every Sunday the bell publicly summoned the faithful. Troubled, the revolutionary authorities sent gendarmes to put seals on the doors of the building. They used the opportunity to tear down crosses. They were greatly surprised the next day, when Sunday, to hear bells ring out at 10 o'clock. They quickly armed themselves and came running. The crowd of parishioners was spread out in the cemetery and kneeling on the tombstones in a deep meditative silence. A dialogue took place between an old man and the sergeant. "What the devil are you doing here?" When our curé left, he promised us that every Sunday at this very hour he would say Mass for us wherever he might be. Superstitious imbeciles, they believe they hear Mass from the place where it is said. Prayer travels more than 100 leagues, since it ascends from earth to heaven. And do you believe you are in a church here, you savages? We are in a holy place, over the bones of our fathers. The gendarmes attempted to force people to disperse, but fearing violent reactions, they chose to back off. That very evening, they sent a report to the Revolutionary Committee. Nothing of the affair came of the affair for lack of enough soldiers to disperse them. To great distress of the people, there were no more baptisms, funerals were celebrated without ceremony, and in the presence of sacristan or the gravedigger near the tomb. They were registered by the mayor as adjutant and the civil register, with the notation for want of a priest in this parish. The situation of the refractory priests was difficult. They were obliged to live in the most complete illegality. Their clandestine existence, along with the requirements that they exercise their pastoral functions, obliged to remain in contact with a large number of people, they were exposed to a permanent danger of being informed on, which was encouraged by the new revolutionary authorities, as many of the letters show. One Abbot Robin and his colleagues in Le Chapelle-Basmière celebrated mass in farms and in vaulted cellars of the castle at Lavrille, the door to which was concealed by a pile of vine stems. The faithful reached it through a well. In the country, they take refuge in the depths of the woods, in a wheat field, a deep ravine, a ditch full of water, a humble charcoal burner's hut or a cottage. Often they even hide in dark caves, or they go down into quarries and abandoned mines. There, surrounded by little children, they speak of the word of life, teach them to love God, to console their mothers, to pray for France, and to forgive. There, in a forest clearing on the bank of the Divaté, in a secluded valley, they celebrate Mass, usually an hour or two before the first glimmers of dawn. A table or some other piece of furniture covered with white cloth is used as an altar, provided with the liturgical minimum. Often an alarm interrupts the ceremony. The priests immediately return to his hiding place. When they hope to avoid a visit from the Republicans, the faithful meet in a more fitting place, a house in which they chose the finest room. Then the windows are carefully blocked, and they speak in low tones. So, as we can see, the prohibitions on priests who would refuse to swear the oath and thereby essentially retain their loyalty to the Vatican and to the Pope, and thereby maintain the unity of the quote-unquote Catholic Church and not be accused by the Pope essentially of being schismatic, now effectively that the priests were excommunicated for following along and agreeing with these oaths. We see the extreme lengths that people went to in terms of holding up their parish communities and keeping this sense of the church in these regions alive. And the emphasis is that in these particular regions in Britain, in the Vendée, that these experiences were perhaps the most extreme in all of France.
One also notices the sort of building habit of tolerating illegality. And I'm sure in the more remote regions that was already the case. But it's noteworthy, to me at least, in the context of at least a couple of the major counter-revolutionary leaders later being also men who were already accustomed to illegality. So in particular, the Chouan brothers and what was his name? Catalano. I can't remember his first name now. Were smugglers, I believe. And so alongside the aristocrats who were already obviously in schism with the state as it existed, particularly the ones who had actively fought against the revolutionaries and the refractory priests, you have essentially elements from all three estates who have already kind of committed themselves to certain forms of illegality, or at least become comfortable with it and defying the state overtly.
Yes, it should be mentioned in terms of a sort of particular history of the region is that obviously it being Brittany, being the west coast of France, these regions were involved in the various wars with the English over the course of the 18th century. And part of these wars with the English obviously involved raising militias along the coastline, and of course raising soldiers. We're talking about other aspects of feudalism, like the implication of corvée or forced labor, basically in lieu of taxation. But in the case of the militias, the peasantry within the region of Vendée were had a great history going back over 100 years in terms of resisting the militias, because quite understandably they realized that if militias are going to be basically called up on a very ad hoc and arbitrary basis, then it would have a serious implication in terms of affecting the harvest, because the usual sort of structure in the laborers and the livelihood of families couldn't necessarily be relied on if they were, again, called up by the state. So already an atmosphere, you can say, of distrust and a demand for reform by the authorities was very palpable within this particular region, which is why, essentially, again, when we look at the cahier or the grievances which are relayed to the Estates General when it's called in 1789, the list of grievances and the expectations of reform, you can say, alleviating taxes, especially, and you can, in many ways, you can say, trying to find some form of relief from the many famines that we see throughout France in 1786, 1787, 1788, makes this region no different. So again, the question emerges essentially as to why this region would revolt so sort of extensively again against the whole basis of the revolution. And it's quite understandable that if they were looking for remedies and they were looking for less government, essentially, and what limited aspects of feudalism that actually existed within this region. It should be noted that sort of there's a lot of social history. Really, Charles Tilly was the historian who decided to make this an issue of regional history rather than political and diplomatic history or even religious history. This was in the 1950s and 1960s. Goes into a vast sort of amount of detail regarding the statistics of, you can say, the extent of feudal territories. But also another argument, interestingly enough, is that it wasn't actually the peasantry so much as it was the petty bourgeoisie in the various towns that were responsible effectively for mobilizing the resistance, because they were far more easy to conscript, you can say, into the army. So that's interesting. So there's another class element here where they're not so much, again, they're appealing to the aristocracy, they're appealing to the church, whilst they're resisting the not the petty bourgeoisie, but the more cosmopolitan bourgeoisie that we see emanating out of the Third Estate and coming down from Paris. And of course, the representatives and later the department officials and the governments, when basically any sort of acknowledgement that there is an overweening authority from Paris. I think this all leads to Secher's conclusion that we're talking about the beginning of a distinctly communitarian spirit in opposition and defiance of central authority. But as it's clear, in terms of a mobilizing factor to create a definitive state of otherness from the point of view of the population in the Vendée, religion explicitly seems to be the cause. And again, why it's obvious now that the Royalists shouldn't be so intimately bound up in terms of their association with religion is that this is a problem that people have to deal with regarding the legacy of Louis XVI, is that even though Louis XVI would attempt to veto and defy the civil constitution of the clergy, because it was still technically a Royalist government, the Royalist government was responsible for beginning the implications and implementation of the civil constitution of the clergy. And as I mentioned, it was actually following on a trajectory which was consistent with the Ancien regime of making the church more Gallican and more subject to the monarchy and less subject to the Pope. And so it's kind of understandable, if you look at it from that perspective, that royalism would only become a more potent force effectively as a broader movement in opposition to the revolution begins to coalesce. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that came to mind as well briefly when you're talking about the townsfolk element, the petty bourgeoisie kind of side of things, if you wanted to continue down the sort of like class analysis or class warfare line of thinking, I believe those were the people who were doing a lot of the buying up of church lands when those were being confiscated, and so they were considered from that perspective to be sort of more revolutionary inclined as well, and often were targets of counter-revolutionary reprisal from that perspective.
Yes, and particularly the restoration of church land in particular was obviously a far more galvanizing prospect for the local population than the restoration of feudal territories to the respective lords. So now we come to the actual course of the insurrection. In an article published in 1913 by Léon Maître, he remarked that rebellion did not break out at every point at the same time. According to Lemaitre, the signal was launched from the parishes in the Loire inferior closest to Anjou and the Vendee. In fact, all the departments were in a state of agitation. In addition to the underlying problems that have been mentioned, the people were in a total state of disarray. Until August the 10th of 1792, noted the commissioner, we shot at the people in the name of the king, that being the storming of the Tuileries, the 10th of August 1792. It was still in the name of the king that the general officer, Charles de Vézion, commanding the Auvergne region, informed the parish of Saint-Loup on October the 29th, 1789, that it would be to the torch, that at the same time 25 people would be shot if 3 prisoners were not freed. The closing of churches and chapels, not served by constitutional priests on March the 6th, 1793, the law on recruitment officially arrived on March the 7th, and its publication the next day were all triggering elements. Everywhere, crowds formed and more or less quickly started to take action. It is difficult to grasp the totality of events related to the military in the Vendee. Let us confine ourselves to the populations living along the Loire from Champoux and Nantes. Some cantons were calm, such as that of Leroux-Boutroux. But the tax collector even took advantage on Sunday, March the 10th, a day of rest, to go to Nantes to talk to his director about personal problems. Far from fearing danger, he brought with him only some of the money he had collected. The pace of events was swift. In order to demonstrate their discontent, the people refused to give the names to the commissioners, with cries of "Give us back our good priests," and "Down with these intruders," again the class and the Parisian element. Hamlets, villages, and towns acted in concert, it seems, and had the time to get organized, since they had received the text of the law. In Beauprou, placards had even been posted predicting misfortune to anyone advertising the militia. The inhabitants of Saint-Julien-de-Courcelles proclaimed, "What, we're going to fight for a government like this?" Set off at the summons of people who have overturned all the administration in the country, who have led the king to the scaffold, this again being 2 months after the king was executed, who have sold all the possessions of the church, who want to impose on us priests we don't want, and who throw our true pastors in prison. Never, never in living memory has such a levy been made in the country. Our good priests, and no draft, that being effectively the cry of the people in the Vendee. In Doullens and Saint-Luce, at around 4 in the afternoon, after seizing Mayor Brevet and the Curé Colas, 150 people invaded the town hall and tore up this departmental decree. In Torre, the scene was still more violent. At the moment when Gaudreau, commissioner of the district, was about to proceed to calling the draft, 40 individuals armed with sticks stormed into the room. They made violent statements, into which the commissioner replied when calling for calm. When he read Isnard's speech and the law of February the 21st, which promised bonuses, he was jeered with the words, "Holy liberty, sacred liberty. They have killed our king, driven out our priests, and sold possessions of our church. Where is the money? They have taken everything, and now they want our bodies. No, they will not have them." In vain, Gaudreau reminded them of the suppression of the tithe and the corvées. "All that makes no difference. We have set the liberty cap on our bell. Well, if we are free, we want to do nothing but take care of the work in our fields." The municipal government and the curé were ordered to withdraw. Of the surrounding towns, only Leroux-Boutroux acceded to the request of the recruiters. The insurgent populace immediately attacked the representatives of the central government. The Truton, the constitutional priest, the municipal government, and the tax collector. Around 4 in the afternoon, part of the population of La Chapelle-Bassemer, which seemed little concerned with past prejudices, stormed into the house of the constitutional curé Caperon. He believed himself to be completely safe. Confronted with declarations of insurrections and threats to make him their first victim, he remained calm, but although recovering from a serious illness, he had enough strength and agility to climb the very high walls of the parsonage. He claims later to have avoided countless dangers and confronted the fury of those pagans who had long secretly planned his death. He took refuge in Ancien and then in Nantes. I want to again bring this up because this all gives credence to the idea from the point of view of the Republicans, the revolutionaries now, that they were dealing with a bunch basically of mindless rebels and violent agitators during a time of war. France has been at war with Austria and a lot of the coalition countries since 1792. And indeed, before the Battle of Valmy, just after the storming of the Tuileries Palace in August of 1792, it looked as if the coalition army would take over Paris itself. So the emphasis here, referring to these characters of pagans, again, it's all to emphasize the regressive element which is coming out of the officials who are loyal to Paris, that these are nothing but more than backward provincials, yokels, superstitious. I mean, we've already looked in terms of the statements made by various gendarmes that these are savages, these people. I mean, this all sort of also confirms a point of view from many of the clergy who actually signed the oath, who went along with the civil constitution of the clergy, that as far as they were concerned, there was nothing about the actual substance of the liturgy and the church that was being changed. They were simply, again, reaffirming their allegiance to France first. And so from their point of view, again, they couldn't even understand why these backward provincials, or in this case, the accusation of pagan savages, would be so aggrieved by this process of the civil constitution of the clergy, that they are so, again, primitive in their beliefs and, again, natural traitors to France, that they would have allegiance to the Pope before, again, the national and, from their point of view, the enlightened government in Paris. Do you have anything to say regarding those particular points?
Just that it's interesting, especially like going case by case in like how these various uprisings happened initially. It is interesting, for one thing, how quick it is and how chaotic in some ways. And I think part of this is due to the fact that there were very few outside forces, or indeed anyone else in France really, who expected that much out of this region, either in either direction really. So it was very sparsely garrisoned, which allowed the Vendéens to pick up some momentum quite quickly. And also, it was not particularly well coordinated from outside, because it was not considered to be an especially loyalist or particularly counter-revolutionary place at the outset. So there was not much interest from Britain initially until everything was kind of well underway, nor from many of the aristocrats and emigres and such who were not directly from there or directly associated with one of the areas. It's quite a curious element where it almost has the characteristics of an earlier sort of like medieval, early modern peasants' revolt that then gathers steam and obviously has a very different ideological context.
Well, I mean, people at the time were drawing connections between the Vendéens and the Jacquerie, which was a medieval uprising in the 1350s, the 1360s, around the same time as the Peasants' Rebellion led by Wat Tyler in England. So in terms of the mentalities of the commissioners in France, they were very much thinking along those lines. From the Royalists, they essentially believed that their traditional strongholds were not in this region, especially not in Brittany, which had very weak ties, you can say, to Paris, especially given the fact culturally it's perhaps the most distinct area from the rest of France. But they were thinking of regions like Normandy, and they were thinking of regions like Artois in particular on the border, which is why, again, part of the flight to Varennes involved appealing to the quote-unquote more loyal population in the north, whereas Paris was, again, seen as particularly implacable in terms of their opposition to the monarchy. But now I think it's important just to come to like terminology. We've already looked at the pejoratives, pagans, savages, and all these sort of things. I mean, counter-revolutionaries is another term, and again, I think it's become more of a neutral term in terms of its presentation, but obviously when it was conceived of, counter-revolutionaries, like counter-reformation, it should be mentioned, all of these have a pejorative implication that one doesn't simply have a profession of belief or profession of principles. One simply is reacting. In the case of the Counter-Reformation, one is opposing the Protestant Reformation. In the case of the counter-revolutionaries, they are simply reacting and trying to hold on to an archaic and now moribund structure that's been replaced by the French Revolution. Even talking about the idea of insurgency or insurrection again, these are terms which are associated with dealing with a rebellious population, a treasonous population during a time of crisis, an existential crisis, and during a time of war. And so using such language, I mean, terrorist, again, is another word you can use. especially if this were today, that would be a connotation you can say that could be applied to people in the Vendée. And thereby we see the most extreme counter-insurrectionist methods to put these populations down in order to, quote unquote, save the Republic and save the nation. Even you can say the other sort of contemporaneous terms we see, completely anachronistic aristocrats. The fact that these peasants and these random sort of very impoverished peoples from this backward region were referred to as aristocrats almost uniformly, again, just sort of speaks to the fact that the French revolutionaries were very much intent on presenting these as not just opponents to the revolution, they were also seeing them as part of a greater class struggle. And indeed that these people had privilege for some bizarre reason. I think the far more innocuous term that was used is the distinction between blanc, white, and blue. And if you're going to look at a quote-unquote Franco-French genocide, as Secher has presented, the blue genocide perpetrated against the whites, again, is perhaps how you define French in this instance. But even then, as you know, as everyone listening knows, white, with its connotation, is explicitly royalist. And so there's nothing to indicate that the Vendéans have any particular ownership over the whole idea of white. So none of these terms are, even the term Vendéan, because again, that would denote an entirely regionalist struggle, are particularly useful, and which is why I go back to the whole notion of calling it the war in the Vendée. None of this really satisfies me, and it's all part of this expanding the scope of this conversation to involve as many elements across a longer period of time. But just to very quickly summarize the course of the war in 1793, again, for people listening, you mentioned, Rupert, how there was a relatively weak Republican presence in March of 1793. Well, up until May of 1793, there is a conscious effort to assume an army in the interior. An army of some 45,000 men is assembled and progressively dispatched to deal with elements in the region. But these excursions often involve 5,000 men, 2,000 men, coming from the south, whether it be Bordeaux, or coming again from the direction of Paris towards the city of Nantes. And they do very badly. They are defeated at various battles like Chantenay, Chalon-sur-Loire, and Brescia. At the Battle of Tours, which is on the 5th of May, 1793, we have a great victory, which is won by who already referred to earlier, Roche Jacqueline, Lescure, and Bonchamp, and they quickly emerge as the great heroes of the Vendéan Revolution or Counter-Revolution. At the Battle of Saumur, a month later, on the 9th of June, we really can say this represents the high point of the revolt, where we have the great figure you can see leading the revolt, Catelyneux, who actually defeats Alexander Berthier. Anyone who is familiar with Napoleonic history knows exactly who Berthier was. He was the chief of staff of the empire, a marshal of the empire, and one of Napoleon's most effective soldiers. Indeed, another marshal of the empire who will present himself in this conflict is none other than Davout, often referred to as Napoleon's greatest field commander, but he has been defeated in many of the battles that we see in the Vendée in this region. So the fact that Berthier and Davout would be defeated in this region again at least indicates to me how effective the Vendéans and what they're now referring to themselves as the royal and Catholic armies in the West were doing in opposition, you can say, to the, in many ways, the better organized, had a larger source of manpower, more equipment, gunpowder, materials, as opposed to the rather ad hoc and, as we'll see in terms of the guerrilla campaigns and banditry raids and having to seize catches and then retreat into the woods, the tactics that were demonstrated by the Vendéans were incredibly diverse. But Catelyneux goes on to take major towns throughout the province of Maine, and this is then followed by another great victory at Châtillon, where an entire column of Republicans, some 5,000 men, is annihilated by the Royalists, probably one of their greatest victories. At another battle, at Vihia, the Royalists defeat an even larger Republican army, again under the command of later Marshal Berthier. And yet the Vendeans failed to defeat the Republican garrison at the major town of Nantes, which would basically secure control over the western part of the Loire. And you can say in many ways was the largest sort of potential city, again, to link all the rebellion together and establish a formidable redoubt. And it's during the siege that the great leader Catelinot, who would later be referred to as the Saint of Anjou, indeed, it was quite sort of beautiful when I went to Angers recently, a couple of months ago this year. Again, they even in the cathedral now they have an entire wing of it dedicated again to the great martyrs of the cause of the Vendée War, including Catelinot as the saint. But having again led so many victories against the Republicans up until July, in August we have the creation of the so-called Infernal Columns. The Infernal Columns leading operations under the command of the Revolutionary General Turreau for the sake of exterminating brigands throughout this entire region. Again, brigands, another terminology in terms of completely delegitimizing their cause from anything which they believe essentially to be sacred. And we have one of the other great commanders following the death of Catelinot, which is d'Elbée of the Royalists. He was defeated by a significantly smaller force at the Battle of Luçon on the 14th of August. And then he was defeated again 2 months later at Tremblay. And then again 2 days later at the Battle of Cholet, now under the capable command of the Republican general, one Kléber. And as for d'Elbée, he was captured and he will be executed 3 months later at the beginning of 1794. And this is where I want to briefly refer to Jean-Baptiste Carrière. He was the representative of the Committee of Public Safety, and he was the main civilian official leading reprisals against Vendean sympathizers in Nantes. The infamous drownings at Nantes, these began in November of 1793. These included 160 refractory priests and continued on for 4 months, resulting in the deaths of thousands of civilians and women and children. It should be mentioned, as for what happened to Jean-Baptiste Carrière, that following the fall of Robespierre in summer of 1794, Carrière himself was executed for war crimes by the new government in Paris, the Directory. So in terms of a brief overview of the course of the war in 1793, Rupert, would you have anything to add?
Not too much within the timescale that we're talking about. Just some additional bits that, yeah, it is interesting that looking ahead a little bit later, Napoleon himself will sort of dodge out of a posting to the Vendée, and I have to imagine that part of it is, I mean, there's different reasons given for it, but yeah, one of them probably is that it's just a very unglamorous and easily and sort of like easy to make a scapegoat out of anyone who was doing there what was, you know, probably ordered and made to consider was necessary at the time. So yeah, very unglamorous posting, and yeah, he seems to think it would have been a dead end to his career, and he was probably correct in more ways than one, going by that example. But in case we don't circle back around to them, it's also interesting that there were multiple Rochejacquelins who were involved in commanding the Catholic and Royal Army. I can't remember how many there were in total. I think there was 3 of them, and 2 of them died. And the remainder of the Rochejacquelin family were very highly praised and celebrated after the Restoration. And the same goes for Catelinot, because Catelinot himself had been, as I was saying earlier, one of the people who had been a smuggler earlier in life, and was apparently considered very highly in his little locality. But after his death, and after the Restoration, of course, his son, I believe it was ennobled. So yeah, there is some reward for their heroism.
It's very interesting with de Catelinot is that he almost reminds me of a William Wallace type figure, a very similar sort of backstory, perhaps a petty noble and petty criminal who finds this greater calling effectively and leads a great sort of rebellion to immediate victory, but as we'll see, the cause ultimately amounts to nothing. in terms of its military success on the field of battle. As for Henri Rochecolin, what's remarkable about him, again, is that he rose to prominence at such an early age. He was in his early 20s when he began winning all of these great victories against the Republican armies. And I believe he was, again, I might be incorrect, he was only 22, 23 when he was finally killed in 1794. So we're talking about, an interesting argument that was presented essentially in terms of trying to chastise the whole notion of the noblesse d'épée, the nobles of the sword in France, is that they'd had very little in terms of opportunities to demonstrate genuine heroism or the qualities of leadership and martial virtue, which again was incumbent upon them as members of the nobility. But in terms of the nobility who actually fought for the Catholic and royal armies in the Vendée, again, we just have many instances of them demonstrating these heroic sort of actions in spades. But nevertheless, that shouldn't detract from the idea that these were in many ways guerrilla fighters, as you've already alluded to with Catiline. This is where it comes to perceptions and resolutions and many, you can say, primary sources regarding the war, which is where I return to Secher. By choosing the word Vendée, the politicians hope to impose a rather reductive form on this movement. By extrapolation, they were quite naturally extended the characterization to any region that was hostile to the regime in all centers of refractory priests. In other words, a little Vendée was just a center of regional insurrection. And yet, according to historian Doré-Gresselin, all these parishes answered present to the tocsin, even if their hearts were not in it. Why the Vendée and not the rest of France, certain historians wonder, and the question is often badly framed. In fact, at the time of the Vendéan uprising, a number of departments were in turmoil. In the west and the southwest, Caen, that being in Normandy and Bordeaux, had already set up independent governments. In the southeast, Toulon had surrendered to the English, and Lyon became an armed camp, which again was brutally put down by the Jacobin government. Indeed, in the course of the spring and summer of 1793, the central government maintained control in only 30 departments at most. The revolution had disappointed. Worse, it had created fear among the populace. So how can we explain the fact that the insurrection was not general, i.e. not a broader civil war as opposed to these little regional pockets, often with very particular causes? The cause of the revolution, you can say in Lyon, was very distinct from the cause of the revolution in Nantes. We can suggest two reasons: the lack of a concerted plan among the rebels, the extensive and energetic activity in the extreme minority in power. The Bolshevik Revolution seized power in similar circumstances. The Montagnards had a leader, Robespierre, a will, and a means. On October 1793, the convention decreed that the provisional government of France would be revolutionary until peace had been attained. Robespierre defined this meaning without ambiguity. The aim of the constitutional government is to preserve the republic. The aim of the revolutionary government is to establish the republic. It is thus subject to less uniform and less rigorous laws, because the circumstances in which it finds itself are stormy and shifting, and especially because it is forced constantly and rapidly to put forth new resources to confront new and pressing dangers. The revolutionary government owes to good citizens all the protection of the nation. It owes the enemies of the people only death. This notion of less uniform and less rigorous laws, i.e. arbitrary justice, revolutionary tribunals, this is part of the justification for the terror that is all justified by the emergency situation in which the state has basically placed itself, which is why the Committee of Public Safety, a mere subcommittee of the National Convention, which was supposed to wield true power in France at that time, became essentially the de facto leading body within the government. In the case of the Vendée, again, we take all of these arguments about eliminating all threats to the Republic and the various reprisals that we see throughout France, especially in Lyon. And then we come to the Vendée, and we come to Turreau, the general leading the infernal columns, who declared the Vendée must become a national cemetery. And indeed, in terms of trying to understand this logic, I come back to Jules Michelet, the most famous French historian of the 19th century, who, when writing of the war in the Vendée in his history of the French Revolution, logic itself says that the crueler of the two sides was the one that believed it was avenging God, that sought to match unlimited suffering with unlimited crime. In shedding blood, the Republicans did not have such an exalted vision. They wanted to suppress the enemy, nothing more. Their firing squads and their drownings were a means of shortening death and not human sacrifices. So what are the tactics? And again, referring back to Secher, Vendean tactics surprised the Republicans because in many ways, ironically, the Republicans were the heirs of an older military tradition of the 18th century, the basis of which were maneuver and pitched battle. General Turreau was effectively astounded by the Vendeans. Let us now speak of the Vendeans. Let us speak of these truly extraordinary men whose political existence, their rapid and remarkable progress, and especially their unprecedented ferocity, will mark an epoch in the annals of the Revolution, of these Vendeans who are lacking only humanity and another cause to defend in order to embody all the characteristics of heroism, a way of fighting hitherto unknown and perhaps inimitable insofar as it can only be used in the region and is tied to the spirit of its inhabitants, an unbreakable attachment to their party, a boundless confidence in their leaders, such great loyalty to their promises that it can replace discipline, an indomitable courage that withstands all kinds of danger, fatigue, and deprivation. This is what makes the Vendeans redoubtable enemies and must place them in the first rank of a warlike people in history. In any event, the Vendean army long had an advantage, especially when it followed the tactics of guerrilla warfare and ambush. As Victor Hugo said so well, the Vendean is a smuggler, a labourer, a soldier, a shepherd, a poacher, a sharpshooter, goatherd, bell ringer, peasant, spy, assassin, sacristan, and creature of the woods. Vendée was a veritable maze of thickets and sunken paths. Only the inhabitants knew its secrets. In his memoirs of the war in the Vendée, Kleber, again, one of the great commanders of the revolutionaries, declared, "It is an obscure and deep labyrinth in which one can walk only by feeling one's way. Through the system of redoubts and natural fortifications, one has to find tortuous paths. As soon as you leave the main roads and wish to go into the deep interior in the territory, there are nothing but impossible defiles, not only for the artillery, but for everything that does not have the narrow span of the carts of the country. And even the main road offers no advantages, but that of great width, for they are bordered by the same system of enclosures. The place where some kind of deployment would be orderly are extremely rare." In a letter from the division commander, General Marceau, the provisional commander-in-chief of the army in the West, to the Minister of War, his declaration was without ambiguity. It describes the attack on Le Mans, to which the Vendean army, exhausted and beaten by Tilly, had withdrawn. Dawn had barely broken when the light of the vanguard of the division asked my permission to make a bayonet charge, which I granted. A dismal silence, interrupted by the cries and moanings of the dying, told me the success of this venture. This truly republican boldness disconcerted the enemy, who evacuated the house en masse and thought only of seeking safety first, in flight. Then, abandoning the baggage and throwing their rifles aside, they took the road to Laval. And again, this is really describing the extent to which this is a war from the point of view of the revolutionaries on brigandage, on reaction, on smugglers, and how there is no quarter given and there is no compassion or identification, really, not only of these as fellow Frenchmen from the point of view of a patriot, but even human beings. Our soldiers butchered them horribly in the town, pursued them so relentlessly on the road that they soon overtook not a few stragglers, but an entire rear guard. I just ordered Westerman, again one of the other very prominent Republican generals, to take to horse with the entire cavalry. The speed with which he acted did not give the enemy time to go very far. He caught up to them, and charging them with the boldness you know he has, he spared such terror among them that they thought only of making an about face to fight him off. Soon the whole road was covered with the dead. The infantry, following swiftly on the cavalry, killed all those who had been left behind, as well as the men who tried to escape their blows by leaving the main road. Despite the harassment they suffered, our troops covered 8 more leagues, constantly massacring and amassing huge spoils. We see 7 artillery pieces, 9 caissons, and countless women. 3,000 were drowned at Pont-de-Meaux. Many crosses at Saint-Louis and Malta told us we had killed many civilians. If one has told us the power of Joshua to stop the course of the sun, it would have been to the end of the brigands. None could escape our blows. Some thought they could find refuge in the villages away from the road. The energy of the peasants must have been a great surprise to them, for they showed the fighters no mercy. I evaluate their losses for the day as at least several thousand men of their best troops. You will have trouble believing that ours amounted to no more than 20 dead. It is true that we had 150 wounded. Each man on this decisive day did his duty, and I would have to name you every individual. I wanted to name all who distinguished themselves. A delirium of blood and sadism took hold of the soldiers. They kept the most distinguished women and the nuns as spoils of war. They stripped corpses of their clothing and carried them on their backs. They called this operation unlimbering. According to Béjarry, they went so far as to place cartridges inside the bodies of the victims and then to light them. Prisoners, said the Abbé Denot, old men, women, children, priests were dragged to Pontier to be shot. An old and infirm priest was unable to keep up, so a soldier stabbed him with his bayonet and said to one of his comrades, "Take the other end." They carried him until the poor man gave up the ghost. A man carting of corpses, according to a witness, struck the victims on a pitchfork and piled them in his cart. The blues cut down victims without stopping. Again, blues referring to the revolutionaries. I saw corpses, wrote Representative Benabin, by the side of the road, 100 of them naked and piled up on top of one another, a little like pigs prepared for salting. 27 Vendéan women with their children, brought back into the carts from Bontab, were killed on the place de Jacobin. This is the finest day we've had in 10 months, exclaimed Preau. Again, it's interesting how the exultations and self-congratulation from many of the generals and commanders has actually, as far as I'm concerned, crept into the discourse regarding the historiography of much of the pro-revolutionary historiography, which is, in many ways, you can say, dominated the mainstream discourse until relatively recently. And I guess my question is always to look at this and essentially say why. And it almost forms a natural extension of dehumanizing and othering the sense of these victims. And this actually forms a great part of Secher's argument as to why this forms a genocide, is that in order to justify these extreme atrocities committed, where we are talking about a counter-insurrection that resulted in the deaths of potentially around 200,000 civilians, that the only way it could be justified effectively was in dehumanizing the entire local population. And because it was a guerrilla conflict, seeing the entire population as being implicated in the struggle against the French revolutionary regime. And so the only result essentially was to perpetrate a wholesale elimination of the entire sort of population still in a state of resistance. Again, it's a very convincing claim, but the reason, again, I push back on it is it also, as I mentioned at the beginning, concedes part of the revolutionary argument that these people should be considered as regionalists first, and that they don't represent part of a broader whole, which is, as the Catholic and Royal armies, we should almost perceive this as part of a constant civil war in France, as opposed to a local instance, albeit one of the worst atrocities that we see in European history.
Yeah, I do very much see the guerrilla war aspects coming out, and in that sense, there's a broad continuity between what happened there and certain tendencies that exist elsewhere, and the disposition towards even civilians later on is, I'm not going to say understandable, but it's something that is replicated elsewhere, usually borne out by a sense of helplessness in the face of the kind of elusive enemy that is sort of beating the theoretically stronger force through to some extent blending in with the civilian population, and I'll expand on that in a second, but also just trying to remain as elusive as possible. And that sense of just not being able to see and strike out at them generates a longer term kind of sense of helplessness. But yeah, I think one of the dynamics of guerrilla warfare as well is that there's a certain level of mass mobilization that is almost invisible, where guerrillas will rely on superior information oftentimes in order to be able to strike where the enemy is weak and know what is happening better than the enemy does. It's almost necessary. And so in that sense, at least as informal, not combatants per se, but informants and spies and such, larger swathes of the sympathetic population will usually be involved. And obviously the housing and resupply of the guerrillas will also fall to local civilian populations as well. And so in some sense, some of the historiography around it almost devalues the struggle and makes the sense in which the Republicans were genuinely, the revolutionaries, or let's say the Blues in this context, were genuinely hated, and it potentially understates the extent to which people were willing to put themselves at risk in order to resist it. So I guess that would be another angle of kind of pushing back on that particular historiographical narrative.
Yes, it is interesting how, as far as I'm concerned, it actually does downplay you can say, the military feat that was accomplished by the Blues. And even, funny enough, reading the memoirs and reading the history of someone like Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle is this bizarre sort of confluence of all of these influences, and the fact that he comes from a legitimist family, and then he attempts to rewrite most of his history to appeal to all factional sort of branches of French history, very anachronistically. But in the case of his father, again, who was very much a sympathizer with the Vendeans, someone with, again, the military history background of someone like a de Gaulle, he was a niche theorist more so than a battlefield commander, which was demonstrated during the fall of France in 1940. He looked upon the legacy of generals like Turreau and Kléber, and later Hoche, with great admiration for what essentially they had accomplished in terms of seeing the successes of the Whites and how they've been able to effectively mobilize an army which had accomplished great feats and acts of heroism, and how they've been able to, so in terms of military terms, successfully accomplish this. I mean, a lot of leftist historians, again, identify this as being the great victory of the Republican regime, the fact that it was able to purge, for the most point of view, pacify its internal enemies. And then we get to Fleurus later in, I believe it's in July of 1794, where for the first time, not only is the French revolutionary regime secure, but it's larger than the French monarchy ever was, effectively. So we're seeing, again, genocide. We're also seeing, from the point of view in terms of actually undermining their own position and seeing this purely as an insurrection, a great sort of military feat that's also been accomplished here. One point I wanted to emphasize regarding looking at the civilian populations is that priests themselves invariably did not join on the side, were not joined in battle. But because the argument was from Paris that this movement wasn't as a result of the mistakes that were being made and the overreach perpetrated by Paris, it was instead the result of agitation by the priests. And because of that logic, essentially, all the priests were seen as combatants, even though, again, they weren't partaking directly in the battles. And so when we see, for example, with Carrier's response at Nantes and the killing of 160 refractory priests, these were all seen as justified countermeasures in order to ensure that there would be no instigators in terms of riling up a new rebellion directed against the National Convention. So from a horrific and cold logic in terms of simply eliminating resistance during a time of war, you can understand essentially why such horrific measures would be used by people, again, who have no compunction about violence or humanity, and part of, again, the process of denigrating these people as Vendeans and whites and not as Frenchmen is effectively to morally justify the response here.
it's interesting as well, bringing up de Gaulle, that later on in the sort of 50s and 60s, the French counterinsurgency tactics, of which they were considered somewhat pioneers of a sort, did revolve around a similar kind of continuity of strategy, let's say. So kind of like brutality, albeit in that case it was applied far more precisely. Curious kind of symmetry there.
So when we come to you've already mentioned the Chouans, the chouannerie, the origin of it is literally just that Chouan means owl. It was a nom de guerre, a war name given to one Jean Quatre, who referred to himself as the Chouan, and this actually originated in the Basse-Mont. It didn't originate in the Vendée, but eventually the revolt of these so-called tawny owls, also known as the Silent Ones, who effectively became associated with the guerrilla, albeit the term guerrilla, as we'll see, is actually originated from Spain a couple of years in the future, which is interesting. So I have a hypothesis that I have regarding linking the Peninsular War and the war in the Vendée, but nevertheless, the Chouans are able to begin guerrilla movements throughout Brittany and the southwest of Normandy, albeit lacking the intensity that we see regarding the war in the Vendée. Hence why it's called the war in the Vendée and not called, in English history, say for example, during the reign of Edward VI, we have the Great Revolt, or the Great Rising in the West, which is nothing. It follows a similar logic in terms of the motivations for that cause, but it's nothing in terms of the ferocity and the bloodshed that was committed here. But of course, for some reason, French historiography has not referred to this as the Great Rising in the West, even though perhaps it would be appropriate rather than dividing up the chouannerie from the war in the Vendée, but what have you. Like the war in the Vendée, we see a massive resistance to conscription, later the levée en masse by Lazacanot in March of 1793. In particular, there was an instance in one town, Les Roches-Bernard, where 6,000 people stormed the town and basically massacred the representatives of the government who were trying to issue the law which had called for the assembly of these militias. The leader of what later referred to as the chouannerie was none other than Georges Cadoudal, who had been a veteran of the war in the Vendée, and he had actually been rescued from the Vendéan disaster at the Battle of Savernay, which is perhaps the last sort of significant battle that we see during the course of 1793. And so he continues the struggle throughout most of 1794. And unless you want to sort of get more into specifics about the chouannerie, I think this is finally a time to actually come back to what was going on with the actual royalists in order to try and find an overarching sort of understanding of the strategic situation for this conflict.
Just that the chouannerie is interesting as a comparison to the Vendée, because for one thing, so it starts off, I believe, as an emergence of the Breton Association, which I mentioned earlier, Colonel Armand, I believe, Armand Toffin, Marquis de la Rouerie. He was involved in that. He was a founding member as well, but obviously the Breton Association was not able to sort of gather the same momentum that the Catholic and Royal Army did, and so they were never able to launch major sort of contesting campaigns in the same way that the Catholic and Royal Army was, and so it sort of became a guerrilla war much more quickly due to limitations of numbers, as far as I understand it. But there's another interesting comparison in that I believe it was also more so supported by Britain. So they had, I believe, Jean Chouan, or the Chouan himself, briefly spent some time in Britain and received some some material and monetary support. But so that may be one of the reasons why it kind of is able to last a little bit longer than the Vendéans did. But yeah.
Well, this all becomes rather semantic. I mean, I refer to the rising in the West, and I basically say that this is a failure of a historical categorization. I would not distinguish between these two conflicts. I would say that this is a general rising throughout Brittany, the Mont, and parts of Normandy. And so we should see parts of the war in the Vendée as a guerrilla movement continuing up until, in earnest until 1796, in which case, again, they involve all of these elements. But you bring up the point about English assistance, and this is significant because our through line regarding the Vendée and part of the Chevalier is that this seems to be a domestic rebellion first. And because it's a domestic rebellion first, it only takes on a explicitly royalist association later. And you can say even the aristocratic association is incidental in many ways. There are priests, of course, refractory priests, you can say, are the most consistent feature in terms of their opposition to the regime in Paris. But of course, aristocrats were also fighting on the sides of the revolutionaries. But in the case of the quote-unquote emigres war, the war fought in particular by the three leading, again, nobles, now that Louis XVI has been executed, the Comte d'Artois, the Duke of Provence, Louis Stanislas, who would later become Louis XVIII, and Louis Anton, the Duke of Angoulême, who would later become, again, the Dauphin in 1824, because he was the son of Charles X. All of these figures have the issue of being directly associated with foreign interests, and as a result being conceived as puppets. Part of the terminology in othering the process of the Vendéans is in presenting them basically as Vendéans versus the patriots. The Republicans, the revolutionaries, are for France, whereas the Vendéans have to be for something else. And the emigres were explicitly seen as nothing more than the vehicles, the conduits of foreign interests, and that, you can say, in many ways hurted their reputation at the time and hurted their reputation ever since, especially during the Restoration. So, but that's not, again, to say that they really were, simple sort of puppets in the interest of foreign powers. They intended to come back and they intended to restore the monarchy as was before 1789, in which case, France was a proud, defiant Gallican power, and wasn't simply seen as, Metternich would basically conceive of France later as simply a pillar in establishing a European conservative order. But yes, Rupert.
We brought up the comparison with the Bolsheviks earlier, and the comparison with the whites also sticks out very clearly as well, in that sense of, not only earlier we were discussing, or you mentioned the rather fractured interests and strategy of the various groups that made up the counter-revolutionary or royalist side of the civil war as we're portraying it, but also in the fact that the central government, or the inheritors of the central government, were broadly successful in portraying themselves as the nationalists against the various white forces who could be successfully portrayed as either parochial regionalists or captured by foreign interests.
In particular, in Russia, of course, it was more extreme because the whites were associated with separatist movements in the Baltic, in Finland, in Ukraine, the Cossack movements in the south and the Caucasus. And so, interestingly enough, the Bolsheviks, again, despite being internationalists, presented themselves as the Russian movement centered in Muscovy again. But as for, again, the intentions of the Comte d'Artois and the Duc de Provence, when Louis XVI was executed at the beginning of 1793, he declared that, beyond question, the king, i.e., at the moment this would have been Louis XVII, who was the son of Louis XVI, who was imprisoned in Paris, must be re-established in his domain. The princes in their appanages, the clergy in their possessions, and the seigneurs in their rights, and the emigres in their property, the departments, the districts, the municipalities will be broken up, and the municipal governments in the cities and the communes in the rural areas will be re-established as they existed in the month of May 1789. So again, there is no sort of more conscious sort of declaration of a restoration in its absolute and purest sense that this was going to be a totalizing restoration that reverted the clock since before the revolution in July. And by May 1789, they're not just referring to the storming of the Bastille, they're referring to the summoning of the Estates General as well. All such basically attempts to reform the monarchy would be rejected. And of course, as we already see, with part of the motivation, you can say, of the figures in the war in the Vendée actually resisting government overreach and actually seeking a form of government reform, their great, spiritual and ideological redoubt comes in the form of the refractory priests, how there would already be some friction here. And part of the reason, again, why the Restoration was bound to disappoint its most ardent defenders. Because even, again, ultra-royalism, as it would manifest in 1814, was not of this opinion, of the view of the Comte d'Artois in 1793, that this was going to be a pure restoration. Indeed, part of the issue, again, coming back to this being a vehicle, the émigrés perceived as being anti-patriotic, as being seen as nothing more than the vehicles of foreign interests, is that at the height of the quote-unquote army of the émigrés, when they were able to consist around 10,000 men, they were amassed under the former royalist marshal Bourgeley during the Duke of Brunswick's invasion of France in 1792. They were, in fact, I would say, culpable in the Brunswick Manifesto that indirectly led to the storming of the Tuileries Palace in August of 1792, and by extension, the end of the monarchy. That would have been a moot point, of course, had Brunswick been able to take Paris, but alas, he did not, and so the émigré army was disbanded after the crushing victory of the Republicans, the Battle of Valmy. As for someone like Comte d'Artois, I mean, he begins by, as you referenced, going to Turin, Savoy. He then goes to Austria, attempting to appeal to Emperor Leopold, and only again, with some success, is able to win the emperor on side in terms of the coalition. But it's really, you can say, France declaring war on Austria, which has far more of an effect on Austrian opinion than the agitation of the Comte d'Artois and the émigré party. The émigrés then established themselves in Koblenz on the left bank of the Rhine in Germany. And then figures like the Comte d'Artois will go to St. Petersburg and London, where he forms a very good impression on Catherine the Great, but then has a very mixed reputation with Tsar Paul and especially with Tsar Alexander.
I think it's sort of hard to quantify, but although at the macro level, some of the exile influence might be hard to measure, I tend to see a pattern where when these kinds of political radical dissidents move from, especially recently aggravated, go from place to place, they tend to form a kind of force for political change in the direction that they pursue themselves, even among the domestic politics of wherever they go. So, while you could obviously point to the actions of the revolutionary government itself in France for sort of inflaming the politics of all of the other various European powers, one of the primary ways that, or at least a major way that information proliferates and the excesses are made known is via some of these exiles. So the fact of them traveling around from place to place, court to court, I would tend to link towards the, you could say, reactionary policies, which are then carried out towards domestic radicals.
Well, interestingly enough, I would say that this is more truer of France's, you can say, perennial enemies being England and Austria than it is true, you can say, more natural allies being Prussia and Russia in particular. Russia is very inconstant in terms of its attitude towards the royalists, whereas England, of course, being the most persistent enemy of the French Revolution, again, actually turns out to be the most stable place of exile for the royalists, which is where we get into 1795, and really the last sort of great hope before the fall of Napoleon. During the year 1795, there is the great fiasco for the coalition wars, is that Prussia, which, as I mentioned, under other circumstances ought to have been a great ally of the émigrés, decides to not switch sides, but declare peace and declare its neutrality. And it would basically remain, you can say, positively predisposed towards France in many ways up until its declaration of war on Napoleon in 1806 and the disaster for Prussia that follows. But regardless, for the next 10 years, basically, Prussia is no longer a consideration. But despite that, in 1794, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, figures like Saint-Just, had been overthrown, and Couthon had been overthrown and executed, and a new regime was now placed in charge. And this regime was, again, despite creating a new constitution, which was ostensibly more conservative, with a more stable executive under a 5-man team known as the Directory, it was actually very unstable. And despite the fact that in 1793, the forces under the French revolutionary government had been successful in defeating the Vendéens on the field of battle and defeating the Chevalier, because the guerrilla movements never went away, and because the English were still committed again to defeating the French government, the weakness of the central government actually provided an opportunity. So in 1795, they begin an invasion of Brittany at Quiberon under the figure you can see on the bottom right here, the Comte de Poussey. And would you like to expand a bit more on this conflict? Because again, it's one of these events essentially where there was an expectation for a great royalist uprising throughout all of the West. The expectation was that the insurgency was going to be far more effective than it really was. And because, again, the British and the royalist commanders had actually overestimated the level of support, they effectively, because they had so radically overestimated the level of support, they ended up turning this event into a fiasco and a complete and utter decisive defeat in which most of the royalists were captured. So I guess I would ask you as to why this happened.
I would say probably, once again, I mean, to build on my point, my previous point was kind of the exiles having the ear of the English government, and perhaps in that case, or the British government in that case, too closely, perhaps. And although it might have been a reasonable assumption to make that Brittany would rise to a greater degree than it did, and perhaps the whole rest, the western regions in general, clearly there were some factors that were not in place that were there for the Vendée. We've talked before about some of the background culture that the Vendée enjoyed that other places might not, in their sort of general belligerence towards central authority. But Brittany, maybe was just being left alone to a slightly greater degree. Though actually, I should say, Brittany is also curious in that it was one of the places where there was a great deal of revolutionary fervor in some other ways. So I believe it was one of the first places where they had very early on, they had one of the more radical local gatherings of, I believe, swearing off their feudal aristocrats, swearing off their feudal privileges and such.
Well, you mentioned the Breton Association. The other organization, of course, is the Breton Club, which was the predecessor to the Montagnards, which, of course, was the broad faction, including the Jacobins.
Yes.
So, yes, it's simultaneously one of the most reactionary and most revolutionary areas in France.
Yes, but one thing I should say about that, though, is that at least, as I understand it, the French exiles did not simply set the Bretons and the British up for failure and sit back and watch. They took part themselves and suffered many of the consequences in the landing, I believe. But one of the things, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say one other thing that we kind of skipped over that I think is worth mentioning is during the opening days of the Directory, you get the so for one thing, the Directory, despite having the reputation of being a relaxing of the terror, actually basically continued it, but in a far more directionless fashion, and partially as a result of the general confusion, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm suddenly having doubts, but this is when you get the first white terror.
Well, yes, these are what you're referring to by white terror is that the Directory was as concerned with radical Jacobins and the restoration of a regime akin to Robespierre as they were to quote-unquote monarchists. So it was a regime that basically managed to alienate everyone in its term. And by 1797, with the counter-coup of Fructidor, the Directory was basically in a situation where it had rigged the electoral system to ensure a permanent quote-unquote moderate identity. And whilst you have the part, you can say, of the White Terror, actually moves on to target an even more radical element of the revolution, which is the Revolution of Babeuf, who many communists basically see as a proto-Marxist, in the sense that we're talking about, first of all, a bourgeoisie revolution, and now we're talking about a economically redistributist campaign as well. And many of the figures around Barras, who was the mainstay of the Directory government, and Carnot, it should be mentioned, who had survived the purge of the quote-unquote Thermidorian reaction. These figures, again, were more interested, you can say, in preserving their own economic gains and their own political gains, and which is why actually many of them would later go and join Bonapartism, because Bonaparte was actually seen as a force of stabilizing the Republican regime rather than ending it.
Yeah, and for the purposes of this conversation, it's worth noting that the coup of Fructidor was was carried out because Royalists managed to win a slight majority.
Yes, indeed. So when we're talking about, terrors, it's really directed against all fringes, and there are many sort of I mean, we're missing over quite a few points, significant points that happened before here. So I think it's important to mention one key point, which is that we talk about émigrés. We've talked about the attempts of later Charles' attempt to Comte d'Artois to petition the various courts in Europe, but what about his actual direct intervention? Interesting enough, his son, Louis Anton, would land in Vendée briefly, albeit he wouldn't stay there and remain to be captured. He's actually, I would say, a remarkably heroic figure, which is almost completely forgotten in French history, despite the fact, again, he was, you can say, titular king for France for a few hours in 1830. But he was actually one of the few figures who didn't retreat during the 100 Days of Napoleon, who stayed in Bordeaux to resist the government. So he is an exception. But in the case of Comte d'Artois, in 1795, it represented a failure for him to directly join the campaign in the West, which is one of the reasons attributed. And this is taken from a biography of the Comte d'Artois, which you can find the citation is in the description. To the Prince of Condé, the Comte d'Artois wrote as follows: "Thus goes the world. There were some months in which we thought all hopes were here in the west of France. Today, it is the factions of the south and east which provide the most favorable opportunities. The deaths of hundreds of fellow countrymen were accepted in a philosophical fashion, without adequate understanding or appreciation of their sacrifices. Had the Comte d'Artois possessed the courage to assume leadership of the insurgents, it is possible that many Royalists rather optimistically contend that republicanism may have come to an end in 1795. The truth is that Artois and his entourage were not ready to make the sacrifices inherent in the decision to debark and engage in guerrilla warfare against the Republican enemies, which were now prepared to give special attention to the western provinces. A few months earlier, in the Quiberon fiasco, that being the invasion, had provided proof that a capture might mean facing a firing squad. The Comte d'Artois had neither military training nor experience on the battlefield, and it appeared unlikely that a man who had been so generally disliked before he left France could provide a competent and inspired leadership by the Vendéens. What he's referring to, the Comte d'Artois was considered part of the ultra-royalist faction in court even before ultra-royalism became a thing. In 1789, he was seen as a close ally of Marie Antoinette, who again was also seen as a hardliner within the regime. And he is also one of the first émigrés, so he left the country very shortly after the storming of the Bastille. So as far as, again, the Comte d'Artois was concerned and was effectively affirmed by that manifesto, which was stated earlier on, he was a restorationist in the purest sense of the word. But of course, that also made him an object of derision and hatred among, you can say, many of the more moderate, quote-unquote, Royalists and Catholics. Charette, that being one of the noteworthy commanders and the figure that you see in the center bottom of this image up here, in a letter d'Artois dated on the January 5th, 1796, so this just being a few months before Charette himself was killed, indicated that his position in the Vendée could not be more critical than at this moment. Georges Cadoudal reported that the situation was desperate and that intrigue and ambition and jealousy are destroying us. I think that your presence here is absolutely necessary, since you alone can bring peace for which we have so long fought. We wait with impatience and guarantee that you will be guarded as never before while you are with us." The Comte d'Artois, however, was at Edinburgh, and he dispatched a note to Poussey asking him to come to Scotland and inform him about the situation in Brittany. A short time later, Charette and another royalist leader, Stoffer, were captured and shot. If Artois had truly been an inspirational leader, with the courage and ability to carry through a project once launched, he might have thrown himself on the coast and set western France on fire in 1795, but he was not that kind of man, and the decision to return to England was perhaps correct under the circumstances. The tragic error of Artois and his advisers was to encourage Charette, Stoffer, Cadoudal, and other leaders of the interior, and to promise far more support than was practical or possible for them to deliver. Despite the attempt of the courtiers around the prince to place the blame of royalist failures on Poussey and the British, the prestige of Artois suffered immensely as a result of his failure to land on the French coast. His lack of resolution indicated to the various European monarchs his incapacity to play the role which he had cut out for himself. At Lyon and Gelée, Artois had failed to put in an appearance when the leaders of insurrections were risking all for the Bourbons. Repeatedly, the Vendéans had requested their presence, but their urgent pleadings brought no effective action. The complete failure of the Quiberon expedition, the invasion of France by, again, English support, indicated that the efforts of the émigrés to restore the old regime by military force were not likely to succeed. The second phase of their effort, in which intrigue would replace arms as their chief weapon, was destined to be no more successful than the first. And again, I think this focuses on a core component that we've talked, is that despite the heroism of figures like Catelino and Roger, that this is basically royalist in name only. The émigrés are a distinct entity from the Chouans and the Vendéans in terms of their actual sort of engagement and direction of tactics and strategy within this overall conflict. And really, the other element to discuss is the fact that in 1795, Louis Stanislas, the Duke of Provence, and the Comte d'Artois were still technically fighting for the reign of their nephew, Louis XVII. In June of 1795, Louis XVII would die in the Temple in Paris as a result of neglect and malnutrition. And very shortly after that, we have Trois Vendémiaires, which was the great royalist insurrection, which was being directed in Paris, and who shows up during this this fateful moment where, again, all the stars seem to align. You have the great outpouring of grief following the death of Louis XVII, which I think it was a serious unforced error from the Republicans, basically to give the royalists a martyr and a great cause celebre in terms of the dead king, but also allowing them to consolidate a more, you can say in theory, royalist leadership under the Duke de Provence, who is now styling himself as Louis XVIII. At Vendémiaire, Napoleon intervenes in the uprising in Paris and brutally puts it down, again in the spirit of what we see with figures like Kléber and Turreau, that there is no quarter given, there is no mercy afforded to these quote-unquote insurrectionists who are putting the legacy and the life of the Republic at risk. And among many of these other things, 1796 seems to be the year that, following the months after Vendémiaire, and where Napoleon will begin to actually give legitimacy and glory back to the regime through his stunning set of victories in Italy, that in the Vendée, the army is now under the command of General Hoche, who had also been there at Quiberon, had begun to offer amnesty and limited religious freedom to many of the supporters of the royalists. This was, again, aimed to nullify any popular support for any remaining sort of thoughts about insurrection. It should be emphasized that these promises were not always kept. In the most infamous case with the prisoners of war from the expedition at Quiberon, but as has already been alluded to, prominent figures who are still left, like Charette and Stoffet, have been found and executed. Cadoudal surrendered to the new regime, but only to later escape. And then, as was already alluded to in the book, he would lead a different course of war in terms of intrigues against the Republican and then the Napoleonic government. So in terms of, again, looking at what victory really constitutes, well, as you can already see in terms of General Hoche's offer of partial amnesty and religious freedom, the Directory government had, in some instances, it should be mentioned, very haphazardly relaxed the most extreme prohibitions against Catholicism in France. And I say with that very sort of advisedly, given the notion that many of the directors were very much infused with these ideas of finding a formal replacement for the religion in France. And, Barras was very much in sympathy with these ideas as being the most constant of the directors. So what does, say, for example, Reynald Secher say about the overall effects of this conflict on the region in the Vendée? 7 years after the beginning of the War of the Vendée, the ideological and political situation of the region was extremely difficult and even desperate. The Directory had turned out to be incapable of remedying all the excesses, as a report re-evaluating a mission sent to the minister on the 29th of Messidor of the year 7, this being July the 16th, 1799, indicates its author, one Monod, observes that the crisis remains terrible and that minds are not yet well settled. The state of affairs is caused by different classes confronting one another locally. On one side, the Republicans, on the other, the Royalists. The former exaggerate and are turbulent. The refugees, he calls them, are devoted men, but to be sure, but made mistrustful and of a particularly difficult character because of their misfortunes. Among the latter are former rebels, rather conquered than submissive, and a certain number of influential partisans on the raft for a favourable opportunity to revolt. These two opposing classes are always ready for a confrontation, and it will be opportune to put an end to a situation. Without causing discontent on either side, the government should rally all hearts to bring to one side back to fraternal moderation, without seeming, by doing so, to protect the others, the victims of denunciation and harassment. The important thing is to inspire the people confidence in the government, to appear to believe that they are sincere, to maintain them in their duty without violence, in short, to maintain order and gain time, which alone can settle everything. The author here then goes on to note that the violence always provokes violence, and foreign powers only seek to stir up the West to revolt, to embarrass the government. Since few able-bodied men were killed during the war, a resumption of the insurrection is to be feared at the first opportunity that presents itself. In fact, again, this is a rather idealistic portrayal in the fact that, as you've already alluded to with Fructidor, when there was any hope of the monarchists actually making a constitutionally justified return to power by quote-unquote democratic means, they were crushed, and the election system was basically rigged, and the legitimacy of it was nerfed to the point again that many people look thereafter to figures like Napoleon to find a more permanent solution, which actually involved many of the directors themselves in terms of plotting against the regime of which they were nominally members, including figures like Fouché and Talleyrand. What is so fascinating about the coup of Brumaire under Napoleon is that it basically involved most of the members of the previous government as well. In this case, again, the idea that they can simply wait for time and see that these measures will be resolved clearly wasn't going to be the satisfaction of anyone, and there was a looming fear that the regime was so unstable, that it was so mired in contradictions, that if there was, again, a simple waiting game without a drastic reform like bringing Napoleon to power, that inevitably the Royalists would indeed come back to power. But again, as for looking at this in terms of victory, the period of instability consolidated the legitimacy of the clergy and the institutions of the clergy. So, for example, there was the organization of the Fabrique, which was basically the parish commissioners, which were more or less adjacent to the parliaments before. They had no legal existence, but they had survived despite the harassment from the administration, and they even channeled various popular reactions. At the end of the quote-unquote revolution, so this will be referring to 1799, it had challenged the legal order. It was all the stronger because it was persecuted and independent of any higher authority. Not only had it not disappeared, despite the wishes and actions of all the established authorities, but it also attained during this period an authority greater than any it had under the old regime. So the silver lining from all of this is that despite the horrific actions that have been undertaken by the government, despite the, again, arguably from some quarters and from some interpretations, genocidal intent by the government to other and dehumanize the population, the Catholic aspect, less so the royalist aspect to the Vendéans, has become concreted in the struggle. And as there's such a lack of willingness to purchase into the government institutions, yes, figures like General Hoche have quote-unquote pacified the region, but it's pacification more than compliance, let alone active support for the new regime. And so again, this could potentially provide the basis for a new monarchical reform going forward. They haven't been defeated despite the tremendous amount of loss in life and devastation in what was previously considered one of the most fertile and prosperous regions in France.
Yeah, one thing that does come across to me about the Vendée in particular is the sense in which the grievances just sort of build upon one another. And so, yeah, the antagonism never fully goes away, but the fact that they're able to just sort of relax it a little bit means that they're sort of able to just take the wind out of the sails enough that it doesn't become as much of an active problem anymore. Even though, the moment they attempt to walk back any of that, it will immediately become a problem again looking forward. So, you kind of get the steady build up in the first place of the refractory priests and the execution of the king and the impositions associated with the levée en masse. And then all of that put together basically finally sets the Vendée on fire, and then having to walk some of those back just to, again, make the burden light enough that that not enough people are willing to kind of die for the cause. But that also probably comes in combination, as we were talking about, with the seeming unwillingness of the king or the exiles to really fully throw their weight behind and kind of make themselves known in the West. Probably, didn't help.
The reason I'm again alluding to this and seeing this as the prospect of a possible victory again for the quote-unquote again Royalist side is that I see this again as a regional struggle, which is again focused on finding older Catholic institutions in which basically to have a greater legitimacy over the superimposed Republican institutions, and what a Royalist restoration would look like whenever again the expectation is that the monarchy would return. And I brought back earlier the fact that it reminds me of the Catholic League, and it reminds me of the devoted faction and figures like Fenelon, because it almost has, as far as I'm concerned, the kernels of an argument which was actually presented by Fenelon in how he wanted to reform the absolute monarchy and reform France, again moving from, again, the Vendéens heralding a new monarchy, less so than simply what the Comte d'Artois was focused on, which was a pristine restoration of what had existed before the Estates General. And I just want to take a quick detour from this conversation to really expose what that would have been in the mind of, again, the factions who are advocating from the monarchy to restore it and to loosen the aspects of it, which focused on the absolute and Gallican nature of it. And this is taken from a book which I read regarding when I was doing my Fenelon streams, which is Andrew Mansfield, and his emphasis on decentralization, and also trying to find ways of making the relationship between the church and the institutions productive for the country and for the population. And in this case, Fenelon is pointing to the Languedoc, but the principle still stands with the Vendée. Fenelon pointed to the model of the Languedoc as a working example which has survived Louis XIV's neglect on most of the provincial estates. And it should be mentioned, if you look on this map again, that the Languedoc is the region which has, as we see with Brittany, one of the highest sort of percentage of refractory priests in 1790. It engaged in a number of independent works, while supported by the crown. It stimulated the local economy and raised taxes. Fenelon used this example of the Languedoc to underline the possibility of a loyal province that could cooperate with the crown. Again, cooperate as opposed to have a government which was imposed and representatives effectively that were not only hostile to the population, that effectively dehumanized them. One that worked with the central government, yet remained semi-autonomous through its utilization of its local estates to run its own affairs. This re-establishment of an estate system would enable freely elected deputies to settle local disputes. It would also develop an understanding for the needs of France as a whole, as information filtered back towards the crown. This move by Fenelon saw an assault on absolutist pretensions in favour of a more constitutional model. The introduction of these new assemblies below the King's Council, the restitution of an Estates General, which again you have to bear in mind that many of the population of the Vendée were actively sort of participating in and supportive of the Estates General when it was called in 1789, and they again had their list of grievances as well. The decentralization of power to include local government and the inclusion of all members from all three estates to represent a significant rejection of essentially what would be considered absolutism. It's important to note that despite a wider involvement of the public in this government, the region was dominated, the Languedoc, by a local elite, as would effectively be indicated here in the case of the Vendée. What is clear is that in the tables, which was Fenelon's own working out of a new form of government, is that while he was devolving government, Fenelon was first of all endeavouring to re-establish the fortunes of the nobility. In a section called the Noblesse, the nobility, Fenelon called for an immediate catalogue of all nobles to be made in each province. It was designed to prevent the sale of offices, which diluted the prestige of the aristocracy, while elevating the interest of an ancient nobility, which had been sidelined by venality, i.e. the process of purchasing offices and influence within the French government. Additionally, ennoblement would be controlled to promote stricter rules of rank, guaranteeing that men were only rewarded by exceptional service to the state rather than buying their titles. And again, if you're going to actually look at this as a grassroots movement, figures like the Rochefoucauld brothers, again, would be symptomatic of this reassertion, you can say, of a more archetypal and more medieval conception of nobility, which Fenelon would have recognized. This would see the gradual removal of aspects like the paulette by the parliaments to re-establish the former prestige of office by employing men with ability over pecuniary needs of government, i.e. the demands of government simply to extract as much resources as possible. Furthermore, to confront the amalgamation of financial and political problems, nobility would be allowed to centre a position in magistracy, i.e. government, and in trade. The driving force for this reorganisation, therefore, was a reassertion of an old social order and the preeminence of a high nobility. So again, if you actually look at these reforms, and you can take the Vendée as an expression of something old and new at the same time, I do find it fascinating, because I'm perhaps, I would say, particularly obsessed with the figure like Fenelon. I have an interest in doing sort of more streams on him in the future, even though, again, the YouTube algorithm and my audience seems to not detest the idea, but doesn't exactly seem to be very enthusiastic about it. But nevertheless, reading Fenelon and also perhaps coming back to a figure like Chateaubriand at the end, I can only sort of again look at opportunities that were afforded in the Restoration that actually are historically emergent in a situation like we see in the Vendée, that in the situation of blood and turmoil, aspects of this, heroic revivalism of the quote-unquote white faction could have provided a basis of cooperation between the loyal royalist regions and the centre in Paris.
That makes me think very much so that, again, looking way ahead, and the final attempt to raise the Vendée in defence of Charles X before the Duc d'Orléans and the Orleanists take power, that failed basically because it was pitching a version of royalism that the Vendée was never particularly interested in, even at that later point, which is kind of an interesting thought. But one thing I did also want to mention is that there's it's kind of interesting that during this period that we were latterly talking about, sort of in the chronology of where we've got up to, there's a dynamic that seems to have shifted, where previously the sort of street momentum, the populist momentum, very much belonged to the radicals, and somewhere along the line you could probably fix it to the transition between the Montagnards and the Directory. The momentum has shifted somewhat, so that from the sort of White Terror onwards, and the coup that we mentioned earlier, that all other things being equal, the Royalists will be in the driving seat, politically speaking. And so it starts to take more and more effort by the more revolutionary central government in order to keep those forces in check. So whether that be the Royalists being able to put anywhere up to 25,000 people, like armed people into the streets of Paris, of all places, and threaten their central government, to then be grape-shotted by Napoleon, of course. But in itself, that's quite impressive. And before then, you have the I quite like the name, the Muscadins, sort of like street fighters, dandyish street fighters who are fighting for some version of a white cause. Where you could extrapolate various versions of what that actually meant in practice. But the idea that that street violence is something that's passed to the domain of the whites, not the blues anymore.
Again, all of this is to emphasize that as much as we're talking about the horror and the example that many French historians and military theorists use of the Vendée as a successful counterinsurgency, is that you're quite correct in that it seems by 1799 all the momentum seems to be trending towards conservatism and royalism, which again opens up the question as to whether, again, if the situation in France trended the other way, where Napoleon, like a chameleon, would have completely about-faced, and whether his own personal inclinations or belief had anything to do with the conscious makeup of his regime. And I'm inclined to believe that that would form a part of it, because there's a very conscious postmodern aspect to Napoleon, in which he is basically appealing to the faction which is the most sort of has the greatest inclination towards order within France. And we're talking about a period in which, again, we have all of these great sort of post-Christian fads. We have the revolutionary calendar, we have the 10-day week, we have the attempt to abolish Sunday, which again is a lightning rod in terms of affirming the refractory clergy. It's not just the fact that there is a whole elite ideological strata that's outside of the command of the government, is that they have an entirely different week configuration. Their calendars, their days, their entire lives, the venerations of the saints, all of these things, again, are operating underground. And so what Napoleon is basically doing is attempting to reconcile a entire sort of underground society, which from the point of view of the revolution is illegal. And I see a huge amount of just base sort of pragmatism here, as with the base pragmatism of many figures deciding to throw their lot in with Napoleon, in the fact that Napoleon actually seems to be one of these few figures who would, from one point of view, actually delay the inevitable that would have been a royalist restoration.
Yes, I'm definitely very inclined to agree, especially that Napoleon would kind of find himself a chameleon, because I would hasten to point out that many of, especially Napoleon's rise to national prominence was under the patronage of Robespierre, and then later on he becomes a figure of moderation of the Republican and revolutionary cause in general. But that must be noted that it was at the head of one of the few remaining revolutionary, more revolutionary-minded institutions, and that being the army.
Well, I mean, you can look at Vendee and you can say it's the purest, brutalist expression of what we saw with Kleber and Turreau. But at the one side, you can say, oh, well, this is just consistent with a Napoleon who is prepared to impose order, no matter essentially what regime he's attached to. And again, the political labels are rather ephemeral to him. But regardless, in the coup Brumaire, he wins power, he sidelines his other fellow conspirators and establishes himself as first consul. Now, the expectation is that as he seems again to be recognizing the fact that the more sort of ideologically driven post-Christian elements, anti-clerical, anti-Catholic elements of the revolution have failed in terms of being able to fully substantiate themselves within French life, and that there has to be some sort of restoration, whether he is going to be a permanent figure or he's going to be a transitory figure. In the course of the English Civil War, of course, General Monk, after Richard Cromwell came to power following the death of Oliver Cromwell, acted as a transition towards the restoration government of Charles II, which, following in this line of logic, was very much pro-restoration in its purest sense, in terms of eliminating the legacy of the Republicans and the Commonwealth foul forces, and wanting to effectively conceive of a regime like that of Charles I, albeit in many ways you can say more stable and more successful. But Napoleon was not a General Monk-like figure, much to the frustration of the Royalists. Indeed, one of the other figures that the monarchists will then fixate on is none other than General Moreau, the victor of Hohenlinden, which was arguably the most decisive battle of the War of the Second Coalition. And with Napoleon's own lesser victory at Marengo and Hohenlinden basically established the legitimacy of the new regime. And Napoleon is not going to be one of these very sort of short-termistic governments, which is going to be overthrown by a new regime, as we see with the Directory and its rather unstable legacy. But now we have the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise in Paris, in which a bunch of conspirators, notably involving Coudard here from the Breton campaign and from the Chevalier, organize for an infernal machine, which is basically a contraption loaded up with gunpowder to be thrown towards Napoleon's carriage and blown up. And it was an incredibly bloody event in the city of Paris, and it caused a massive political sort of fallback. Interestingly enough, though, perhaps you can say in terms of Napoleon's full dedication to appealing to the Vendéans and the legacy of the Catholic and Royal Army, Napoleon doesn't point the finger at the Royalists. He points the finger instead at the Jacobins. He uses this as an instance to exile most of, it's basically in many ways a second White Terror. He uses it as another instance to attack the Jacobins and force them out of the country, and you can say stabilize the conservative credentials of his regime. Indeed, he then goes on in 1801, the year later, to preside over the concordat with the church that normalizes relations for the first time and undoes many of the elements of the civil constitution of the clergy. Now, I have, on other channels and elsewhere, actually said that the concordat is perhaps the most successful and the most enduring part of Napoleon's legacy. It effectively established relations between the church and the French state going forward up until Émile Combes' separation of church and state, all the way into 1905. So that again, the achievement of the Concordat in 1801 would in many ways be seen to be a victory for not necessarily the Royalists, but very much a victory for the Catholics, in the sense that Napoleon is attempting to take all the momentum that's trending towards Royalism, and then he's attempting to appropriate it for himself. And this is only followed in 1802, when Napoleon begins to offer partial amnesty towards the émigrés. And even in terms of his attitude towards the émigrés, it's quite revealing. He declared that, true, they are paid by our enemies, referring to the fact that émigrés were almost invariably backed by the coalition powers, Austria, Russia, and England, but they were, or should have been, bound to the cause of their king. He's correctly adducing essentially that their patriotism is royalism first, rather than simply loyalty to whatever government constitutes itself in France, which is why, say, for example, Talleyrand is the exception, not the rule, of the aristocracy and the clergy. France gave death to their action and tears to their courage. All devotion is heroic. So again, Napoleon is showing a remarkable degree of understanding and clemency. You can say again a perception of the conservative direction his regime is going to undertake. But this is again not all to say that despite again the Royalists and their involvement in the assassination attempt with the Infernal Machine at Rue Saint-Nicaise, that Napoleon is turning a blind eye towards the Royalists. Coutadel would become involved in another conspiracy, the quote-unquote Pichegru conspiracy. And not only would Coutadel become implicated and ultimately executed as a result of this affair, but the French police system would try and attach the blame to the Prince of Condé, the Duke of Enghien, who was based in Baden at this time. He was captured and he was executed. And this, conversely, despite all of the, you can say, attempts by Napoleon to appeal, and you could almost say assimilate the Royalists and the Catholic cause to himself, revives all of the worst fears among the émigrés and the European powers that Napoleon is nothing more than another Jacobin. And in many ways, you can say the murder of the Duke of Enghien helps to confirm in the view of, say, for example, Alexander I of Russia, the most significant of the coalition enemies of Napoleon on the continent, to contribute his forces eventually to the War of the Third Coalition a year later in 1805. But despite that, again, Napoleon is simultaneously appealing to the Jacobins who want to persecute the Royalists, and he is also appealing to the Royalists themselves. So what does he do? He brings the Pope into Paris and officiates over a coronation ceremony in which the Pope blesses his reign. It's basically an affirmation of the Concordat again. And this is really the time where we go from Royalists, and the term Royalists mutates because Royalism has now been somewhat appropriated to Napoleon himself, who is presenting himself as a new imperial dynasty, the Bonapartes as a new family in France. And so really you can say post-1804, we have the first division between Legitimists versus Bonapartists. And in terms of Napoleon, you can say being aware of his own lack of legitimacy. I mean, just look at this statement in Metternich's memoirs. Of course, Metternich is going to be very involved as the foreign minister of Austria and later chancellor in the, you can say, legitimation, but also the downfall of Napoleon. One thing which Napoleon always regretted extremely was that he could not invoke the principle of legitimacy as the basis of his power. few men could have so been profoundly conscious as he was of the authority deprived of this foundation is precarious and fragile and open to attack. So again, legitimism arises out of a conscious lack of Napoleon's own legitimacy to present himself as more true to the spirit of royalism than the royalists themselves, and part of the grandeur of his coronation and the conspicuous and ostentatious nature of the portraits by David and the creation of the marshals and of all the imperial grandeur and ceremony, again, is to compensate for this fundamental lack of legitimacy. Because regardless, the royalists, now the legitimists, are still seen to a large section of Parisian society as the true leaders of France, which is why figures like Moreau, who would oppose Napoleon, would form a salon, which is basically seen as pro-Louis XVIII, and he himself is then forced into exile.
I was just going to say quickly, there is one other slightly funny way, I suppose, or at least ironic way in which he tries to kind of mend this divide, which is by simply ennobling many of the Jacobins, the prominent ones anyway, that still remained.
Yes, I think the most ridiculous ennoblement of a Jacobin is making Fouché probably the most noteworthy of all the Jacobins in Napoleon's government. He made him the Duke of Otranto for some reason. In the same way that Talleyrand, who of course was invariably he was a traitor to you can say the first sort of ancien regime and to the Catholic Church, was eventually made the Prince of Benevento. But I think Fouché's example is perhaps the most nakedly absurd in terms of looking at this from a monarchist perspective, and especially the fact that many of his marshals were also derived from the ranks of the petty bourgeoisie and lower orders in France. Not all of them, but a large section of them.
Yeah, and even more bizarre that many of them, I believe, kept their titles after the Restoration as well. I suppose there's a certain logic in that. Stripping too many titles like that perhaps devalues the whole notion somewhat, or wanting to retain a certain sacrality about it. But well,
so we've already sort of iterated that on the one hand, this could be perceived as a Catholic victory. That Napoleon himself is actually symptomatic that the Vendeans were in some senses successful. Yes, the Bourbons haven't been restored to power, but they have a government which is far more pliable in terms of representing their interests. And then that becomes less so the case. And I think this is where I want to get your opinion, in that you referenced earlier the fact that Napoleon, perhaps wisely, was not involved in the war in the Vendée itself, and how it actually acted as a stain on the reputations of Davout and Berthier, marshals of the empire who would go on to later really distinguish themselves. Well, I think had he been involved in the war in the Vendée, he would have perhaps understood the conditions in Spain to a much greater extent, because in getting himself involved in the Peninsular War, all of the tropes about the war in the Vendée, that being a regressive, localized population who were being led effectively by their priests to fight again for the cause of legitimism, royalism in all corners, and again use the geography to their advantage and engage in guerrilla campaigns. You can say again Vendée was the preamble to what we see in the Peninsular War. All of the causes are essentially the same, and if anything, it's the more sort of concrete example of, you know, the Bonapartist regime under Joseph and the Imperials is actually again so defiantly presenting itself in opposition to legitimism as expressed by the Bourbons loyal to King Ferdinand during the Peninsular War. And as we see with the intervention in the West, it also provides another impetus towards a far more successful English intervention on the continent, this time under the Duke of Wellington.
It is a good point. Just before I get to that, though, I did also want to mention that from the perspective of the Vendeans winning, or at least securing those concessions for themselves, it is curious when you again view that in terms of a traditional peasants' revolt, where the aims are relatively limited, and often in that dynamic, the instigators will be killed, but then, or at the very least, severely punished. But then the actual grievances will be remedied. So it falls into the same kind of mold in that regard. But
I would just regarding that, I would
Yeah.
agree with you were it not for the fact that this is a revolutionary government that's effectively been neutered in terms of its more extremist aims of completely and utterly redirecting French society. Napoleon effectively buried the more, you could say, idealistic elements and naturalist elements of the French Revolution. So it did represent a remarkable victory that was, far more profound than simply giving the Vendeans concessions in that regard.
That's true, but as I mentioned earlier, the high tide seems to have passed kind of more universally, and maybe Napoleon was just kind of acknowledging the reality on the ground without having to try to resort to ever greater means of suppression to keep those forces in check. Because if you can't even keep Paris on side, like the Paris streets on side, then what hope is there further out than that?
So I guess before I interrupted you, what was the point you wanted to bring up?
Yes, I was going to say about the guerrilla aspect in Spain. I mean, so for one thing, the marshals that did sort of cut their teeth in the Vendée don't really seem to have been able to impart their wisdom and lessons learned on the wider French army and any capability in sort of counterinsurgency warfare. And I suspect this might have been a more general problem faced by basically any army of the time. But I can't help but note that even Antoine Henri Jomini, I believe is how you pronounce his name, author of The Art of War, with all the benefit of all the insight and all the hindsight and being able to interview all of the various some of the greatest military minds of his time and take all of the lessons that he could from those. He still basically came to the conclusion that he didn't think it was worth treating on guerrilla war, and had effectively nothing good to say about it. He mentions it, but basically just says that it should be avoided at all times. And then it's sort of beneath the dignity of a gentleman officer, which obviously it's quite nice to say that you should just never have to deal with it, but it's going to come up sometimes. But I think it's kind of hiding a deeper truth that nobody really had a particularly good solution to the problem at the time, because especially if we're concluding that despite all of the reprisals that were inflicted on the Vendée, they still effectively won. What chance does France have against all of Spain in that regard?
Yes, and again, my point is that the French really should have learnt their lesson in this regard. Especially if they consider to be the Vendeans to be, as of course they were Frenchmen, to be relatively more enlightened compared to the backward Spaniards. But even sort of understanding those tropes that seem to completely escape them. I think the only point which I don't have enough I don't have enough evidence to really substantiate this claim, but perhaps someone should do a comparison between General Hoche and General Suchet in terms of their more lenient sort of dealings with military government and placating rebellious subjects in this case. Maybe that's an interesting avenue to go by. But of course, this follows another litany of disasters. On the one hand, we have the War of the Fifth Coalition, where Austria is brought in against Napoleon again. But we have the excommunication of Napoleon in 1809, because Napoleon does the very intelligent thing of deciding to piss off the Catholics in his empire by annexing Rome and making his son by Mary Louise, Napoleon II, titular Napoleon II, it should be mentioned, the King of Rome. And you wanted, before we came on, you wanted to briefly mention the sort of second origins of the ultra-royalists in the order of the Chevalier de la Foi, or the Knights of the Faith.
Yes, so it'll be an undercurrent throughout this entire sort of following period, but following the excommunication of Napoleon in 1809, some of the emigres, especially some of the more pious ones, had endeavored to sort of follow this promulgation and try to. I believe at first they might have had the intention of trying to assassinate Napoleon, but eventually perhaps the necessities of the organization that would be required to make something like that happen kind of put them into a position where they might as well try to achieve other things that are perhaps more lasting, and so they found this organization. So the let me remind myself of the name of the fellow who founded it. Ferdinand de Berthier de Salvigny, and some of his family members and associates. They never relinquish control over the organization. They are constantly at the head. So they will be persistent figures in later ultra-royalism as well. But they essentially, early on, they infiltrate the Masons, because it's worth noting that at this time, and for quite a long time afterwards, the source of the French Revolution is believed amongst the French aristocrats to be basically just a Masonic conspiracy of sorts. So the the ideas of de Maistre trying to talk about sort of more structural reasons had not really caught on yet, per se. That was kind of a later thing, but so they concluded that they needed to essentially copy the methods of the Masons and then try to pursue that same idea and that same structure towards ultra-royalism. So they, ironically, perhaps this kind of potentially comes back to bite Napoleon in his invitation of bringing all the exiled aristocrats back, because the Knights of the Faith make up their membership, I think, solely of aristocrats, if not solely, then almost solely of aristocrats. And it kind of has like being a secret society in the truest sense. They built up a sort of network for passing communications, and well, at a more base level, they had multiple sort of different stratified levels of information, where as you ascend into and as you're brought into the organization more and more, you're informed more about the actual nature of the organization. So at the lowest level, you would be brought in as a kind of associate to a organization that essentially presents itself as one of nostalgia. So trying to connect with other aristocrats within the country who you may have lost contact with over the course of the Great Terror and all the subsequent events. And promote the fond memory of the ancien regime, and then as you go up, it becomes evident, more and more evident, that it is something which has a much more active intention, and so it develops things like its own intelligence network and its own mail network to pass. To not only pass orders back and forth, but information, and is able to sort of seed all of these various groups, especially into the cities, which essentially forms a kernel of support which can be triggered by local captains, essentially, and that will have some significant consequences later on.
Well, it's interesting again because it's building upon the intelligence networks that were established by, in particular, Côte d'Adal, and which again perhaps indirectly led to the execution of the Duc d'Enghien. And it's again fascinating that you bring up the example of the sort of counter infiltration of Masonic organizations, because the other figure who would attempt to do that was none other than Alexander I, Tsar of Russia. And the reason I bring him up is because, again, despite this attempt to establish legitimist roots in France in order for any weakness to be demonstrated in Napoleon's regime to actually, again, as we see with all of these attempts, lead a true royalist restoration. The Tsar himself very much prevaricated towards this. The Tsar, for example, routinely exiled many of the French emigres from St. Petersburg due to the fact that he would present himself as an ally of Napoleon briefly and then retreat and then decide to form an alliance with the English. And of course, this, you can say, temperamental nature of the Tsar, among many other factors, leads to the War of 1812, which Napoleon, of course, does disastrously. I think before, though, I return to Alexander and his role in the Restoration, Napoleon, of course, abandons the army and then retreats to Paris due to fears of a coup. Again, I forget the main general who was implicated in that coup, but was there a royalist concern of a potential coup in 1812 that would have forced Napoleon to return?
Not in particular that I know of, because they're one of their main sort of grievances during this kind of period, because they so obviously following on from the excommunication in 1809, they're founded in 1810, and that does not leave them all that much time to set themselves up adequately before events are sort of catching up with them. So they're going to be essentially trying to play catch up with events as they transpire. So I don't think I think they were very consciously in a position to try and wait things out until the Allied armies are already marching into France, and then they're kind of forced into action at that stage.
Yes, just for reference on the coup, it was led by Claude Francois de Maillet, and there is sort of no obvious sort of ideological indication other than the fact that one of the conspirators was one Matthew de Montmorency, who would later be the foreign minister of Louis XVIII. So yes, there was a Royalist contingent that was connected to de Molay, but obviously that coup attempt wasn't successful. But when Napoleon is finally defeated in the spring of 1814, again, what a few people notice is that the Tsar prevaricated between supporting the rights of the Bourbons and supporting the rights of Napoleon II, the child Tsar, for reasons that are rather inexplicable. But nevertheless, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that when Talleyrand turned coat definitively in 1814 towards the Bourbons, that he was one of the great instigating forces behind the Restoration. Whereas figures like Caulaincourt, the equerry of Napoleon, again, were trying to influence the Tsar to come to the other conclusion about restoring some aspect of Bonapartism, but nevertheless, Alexander accedes to the decisions of Talleyrand, and then Talleyrand will ultimately come to represent France in many ways during the Restoration, and in many ways at the Congress of Vienna serve France incredibly well. So this comes to the question of the Restoration, and I would say whether Louis XVIII in many ways portrayed the spirit of the Order des Chevaliers de la Foi and the spirit of the ultra royalists. And obviously, you want to come in, but after I will eventually come to an article by Stephen Holmes, Two Concerts, Legitimacy. But yes, Rupert.
Yeah, I was just going to say so bringing up Talleyrand is interesting in this case, especially in regards to the Chevalier de la Foi, because they did consider him an enemy, and he was essentially presented as a more acceptable face to the coalition forces, whereas the ultras, or the vedettes, is another term that was sometimes used to denote them, the sort of street fighters or like protesters who were more associated with the Comte d'Artois, because green was his color essentially. So they would wear green to denote their allegiance with him, but they were trying to essentially present themselves as various regional governors. So in particular, they were able to show up in force when the English with the Duke of Wellington were advanced into Bordeaux. The Chevalier de la Foi were able to essentially establish themselves as the French representatives, and were basically more or less put in charge of the city as representatives of the French. But elsewhere, funnily enough, I believe Alexander I, as you were talking about with his indecisiveness, he was not very fond of them at all, and tended to try to suppress them where he could, I believe. And so the more favorable figure was Talleyrand, but the Chevalier de la Foi becoming what we would recognize as the ultra royalists as a kind of more mainstream political force, were at first kind of suppressed in as much as possible. So they had strong regional presence, various strong regional presences, but that momentum was able to be kind of kept in check by the Talleyrand government with the support of the Allies and obviously Louis XVIII. But then looking ahead past the 100 days, those forces are essentially unleashed, and they can't really be controlled to the same degree anymore. So it would definitely be worth viewing Louis XVIII and figures like Talleyrand on one side, and the ultra-royalists very firmly on the other.
In the case of, it's interesting, again, you mentioned the vedette and green being associated with the Comte d'Artois. From the Catholic point of view, again, green is the color of hope, but it's also the color of resurrection. So again, a natural color alongside white, which is there to represent purity and now, by extension, intimately associated with legitimism. The irony, of course, in terms of the appropriation of all of these symbols is that green had been the first color of the revolution. It was the color appropriated by Desmoulins when the Parisian mob decided to take over the fortress, the Bastille, before it was later replaced by the revolutionary cocarde, the tricolor. And as with anything, I found this image in particular very interesting because these are the royalists celebrating around a Republican tree of victory. The trees were planted again in terms of affirming an identity which was closer in terms of linking the country of France to nature, and trees is the symbol of France and the symbol of national renewal and rebirth. So again, it seems that all of these ideas are mingling in terms of their Republican applications, and then the royalists appropriating all of these elements back to themselves, in which case the tree, which had actually been a revolutionary symbol, has now returned to become a defiantly conservative symbol about stability, but of course the restoration of the monarchy. And this rather preposterous propaganda painting again indicates the rotund Louis XVIII literally sort of restoring the fallen France, as you can see here in the middle of the map, adorned in much finery and flanked by the various coalition powers. But Stephen Holmes, in his article, The Concepts of Legitimacy, begins by talking about the implications of the Restoration and, frankly, sarcastically quoting de Maistre. He who has not the power, even of making an impact or a blade of grass, believed that he was the immediate author of sovereignty, the most important, sacred, and fundamental thing in the moral and political world, and that, for example, such and such a family reigns because such and such a people has willed it, while he is surrounded by incontrovertible proofs that every sovereign family reigns because it is chosen by a superior power, in other words, legitimism in perhaps its purest sense. The book in which this passage appears from de Maistre was published in 1814, a few months after the sovereign Bourbon family had indeed been chosen by a superior force to reign in France, the superior power being, of course, Alexander I, albeit with my caveat that this was very much as a result of the intercession of Talleyrand. Louis XVIII reigned not by the grace of God, but by the grace of the Allies. The anti-legitimist barb, to the effect that the Bourbons returned in the baggage trains of the invading armies, damaged the legitimist cause less by evoking national dishonor than by stressing the contingency and the ad hoc nature of the Restoration. And again, this was a factor that's been, affecting their whole cause all the way since 1792, when a 10,000 strong emigre army was marching alongside Brunswick, who issued the manifesto that resulted in the deposition of Louis XVI and the storming of the Tuileries Palace. The ultra-royalist conception of legitimacy was doctrinaire, partly because it represented a denial of the obvious. It was an attempt to suppress general public awareness that in 1814, the re-enthronement of the Bourbons had been a political, perhaps a human choice, a prescription that was now only one principle among many for justifying political authority and ensuring obligation. Consent and glory were rival principles and widely accepted ones at that. Perhaps the most striking emblem of the precariousness of Bourbon legitimacy was the furniture and wall hangings in the Tuileries, where everyone could see that the lilies had been hastily stitched on top of Napoleonic bees. So flimsy was the fig leaf with which the legitimists strive to conceal man's naked, shivering nature. It would obviously require little effort to have this sort of legitimacy unstitched. The language of politics is perhaps less a repository of shared meanings and a medium for social consciousness and harmony than an armory where conflicting parties are only too happy to commandeer and brandish the weapons of their enemies. Constitutional monarchists and ultra-royalists were two groups separated by their common but differently motivated adherence to the principle of dynastic legitimacy. Recently, Spain was made aware that a moderate party may seek to block extremism of the right by linking its own destiny to that of a legitimate king. And again, this is a point I'm not going. I think I'm too tired, to be honest, to bring up the point I was going to mention about Chateaubriand. But what the ultimate sort of point regarding legitimism stands is that Napoleon had so decisively embedded himself in the national consciousness, but he was able to provide something that the legitimists were not, which is glory, and of being a French patriot, not aligned with foreign powers. If anything, the 100 Days really confirmed this when he was opposed by virtually every single power in Europe, and he was declared an enemy of humanity, and that the whole world declared war on Napoleon rather than declaring war on France, which was still considered, again, to be legitimate Bourbon territory. So when Napoleon is defeated again, it's a restoration in the sense that once again, it's a restoration at the hands of foreign powers, in particular the armies of Prussia and England under the command of Wellington and Blucher. And I think this is affirmed by the simple fact that Louis XVIII, in terms of his own mission, he was content again to die sleeping in his bed as a king, rather than allow for, again, the far more ambitious hopes of another white terror, quote unquote, that followed the 100 Days and the defeat of Napoleon, resulting in the execution of Marshal Ney, the election of a resoundingly ultra-royalist House of Deputies that could perhaps again have had that one moment of enthusiasm directed towards the royalists as crushing the legacy of Napoleon, who again had brought so much turmoil and pain and suffering and casualties to France, that opportunity was effectively squandered. It also again provided an opportunity during the 100 Days to see the last elements of a war in the Vendée. We have the Battle of Redon, where Chauhans had attempted essentially to seize control of an imperious garrison, but we'd also seen the Battle of Roche-Sevier, which actually involved the death of one General de Souzenay that you can see here on the map. It was perhaps again the last major casualty of the war in the Vendée, all the way in 1815. So yes, the royalists in the Vendée were still at large, and the quote-unquote intruvable chamber, the royalist chamber that had been elected in 1815 on the back of the quote-unquote White Terror, provided an opportunity. But as we know, Louis XVIII was not so much interested in terms of pursuing that, as opposed to continuing along a policy of conciliation with the legacy of the revolution.
Yes, it is worth noting that the Vendée gives perhaps one of their greater contributions during the 100 Days, because of the new army that is raised by Napoleon. I believe a full third of it has to go and quell unrest in the Vendée, which, although given the size of the other coalition armies that were around Europe at the time, especially the Russian army, perhaps I'm sympathetic to the idea that Napoleon never really stood a chance, even if he'd beaten Wellington and Blucher in the Battle of Waterloo. The fact that he was crushed so completely did, I think, do a lot to snuff out that idea of Napoleon being like a valid choice, perhaps, because he was able to give glory to France. But clearly that was in tatters when they couldn't even defeat a small portion of the coalition forces arrayed against them. Effectively crushed in the first section of the campaign.
Indeed, it's very interesting what it takes to disabuse the population of their notions that, okay, well, despite the fact that Napoleon had delivered essentially a year and a half of defeat after defeat between 1812 and 1814, that it's still the Bourbons who are responsible for the national decline and not Napoleon. So we will indulge this fantasy for 100 days where we bring back Napoleon, hoping to completely reverse the situation, and then the inevitable happens, and the French have to be told again, no, this isn't happening. You are not going to be brought to a system of glory. That is no longer an option for you, and so we are left with the royalists. But I think a more sort of substantive point in terms of looking at the war in the Vendée is redefining the nature of royalism, looking at this as a royalist victory, is that from the early sort of beginnings of this conversation is that we were referring to this as a popular uprising first and a royalist uprising second, and its Catholic scruples were emphasized over its royalist scruples. Part of the reason why, again, it failed to become primarily a royalist victory was the fact that figures like the Comte d'Artois never provided that leadership, even when they were given the opportunity to do so. So again, despite the fact that during the 100 Days, we see the last bastion of Bourbon support and royalism being exhibited in the battles of Rochesevier and the death of de Suzanne. Catholic politics in France and conservatism and regional conservatism in particular, as opposed to the more liberal politics and student politics, left-wing politics of Paris, remains a constant feature throughout the entirety of the 19th century. What the legacy of Napoleon had basically demonstrated is that the Legitimists and the ultra-royalists had failed during the Restoration period from 1815 to 1830 to monopolize Catholic politics under the rudiments of quote-unquote legitimism. And so when they were deposed by the Orleanists in 1830, Louis-Philippe didn't represent a true restoration of, a revolutionary government. Rather, he represented some sort of halfway house that was appealing to the history of royal France on the other, but also appealing to the history of Napoleon on the other. He represented a socially conservative and economically conservative regime. And when itself was replaced in 1848, it was replaced by Napoleon III, who was even more fervent in his Catholic scruples than Louis-Philippe had been. So this notion of royalism and Catholicism, and it now being disassociated from the Bourbons, who, as far as I'm concerned, had failed again to present their cause as, again, indisputably and indissolubly Catholic, as opposed to Napoleon, who basically begun to break that coalition. Napoleon III, by contrast, represents that last great alliance between royalism, imperialism, and Catholicism. And it's really only with the Franco-Prussian War and the defeat of Napoleon that Catholic politics in France will forever take a back seat. And even with figures like Charles Maurras, kind of like, again, the war in the Vendée, it will maintain a permanent state of insurgency. But if you're judging victory, therefore, more broadly, you can say that the Vendéans were more indicative of the defining trends of French history in the 19th century, up until really the white flag controversy, where the Comte de Chambord rejected the throne of France in 1873, than any other leading ideology. And so judged in those terms, in terms of being a popular redoubt of Catholicism and social conservatism more generally, but ultimately being flexible enough to appeal to other dynasties and more regimes, the Vendéans were, in some senses, victorious.
I'm inclined to think the failures of ultra-royalism and the Comte Charles X come quite significantly down to the moderation of Louis XVIII, and by extension many of the figures that he wanted to patronize, such as Talleyrand, because so many of the figures kind of indicative of the Vendéan movement were willing to go significantly further, and that's sort of shown by the Second White Terror immediately after the 100 Days, which is only abated basically because the king is kind of concerned about where it's going to lead, and assembles more moderates around himself in order to try to crush what he sees as a threat from his right. But there were many figures which retained incredible popularity throughout the entire period, right up until 1830. So in particular, I would be thinking about a François-Régis de la Bourdonnais, who I believe had he was nicknamed the White Jacobin, basically because his consistent contention was to recreate 1789, but in reverse, essentially to do 1789, but for the white cause, and was willing to use the fullest extent of white street power in order to achieve a full restoration. But many of his other aristocrat compatriots and the king himself were much more scared by that prospect than simply allowing the more moderate constitutional monarchy leaning settlement to remain, and for the restoration to go only half finished. And by the time there was any kind of interest and momentum towards pursuing that kind of aim under Charles X, the momentum had already been slipping, and many of the as previously discussed, ennobled Jacobins and various moderates and such had already been brought back in from out from the political cold, and were much more able to patronize their various interest groups and such, and get their sympathetic clubs working and all their supporters organizing in a way that hadn't been possible prior. But even so, throughout the entire period, the ultra-royalists were able to consistently dangle the threat of greater suffrage, wider suffrage, and sometimes even flexing their ability to project street power in order to get what they wanted and to be able to make threats, because it was understood by everyone that, again, working in this kind of tradition of the Vendée, the lower orders had been sufficiently radicalized in favor of the royalist movement that they would support the ultra-royalist cause.
Yes, and in the spirit of that, of course, Napoleon III came to power on the back of this rapidly expanded franchise and appealing again to the Catholic peasantry explicitly, and also being the last redoubt in terms of preserving the Papal States as a extant government in Europe. So he would again use that same logic, and you can say again part of the motivation for trying to bring back the Comte de Chambord as potentially Henry V of the House of Bourbon in 1873 was off the back of popular acclamation and temporary support of the army before, again, like we see with Louis XVIII, Comte de Chambord basically surrendered the initiative. So in many cases, you can say that what is the sort of main enemy of legitimism? It seems to be the royals themselves are their own worst enemies in this instance.
Yes, it's extremely indicative of ultra-royalism in general, really, that its main opponent and barrier was the royals themselves.
So yes, just to conclude, I think what Rupert and I have both been getting at is that the Vendeans were, again, in a sense, victorious in the sense that they represented a sign of things to come in terms of coalition building and a trend towards allying a conservative centre again with more popular autonomous Catholic elements in the peasantry and throughout the rest of France. And this alliance would remain until we have you can say, really sort of conscious attempts by the Republicans to try and rehabilitate the legacy of the French Revolution in the later part of 1870s and the 1880s. But again, as we can see from the war in the Vendée, again, being effectively won by the revolutionaries in 1796, that they wouldn't be able to essentially appeal to that legacy again and incorporate things like La Marseillaise up until the end of the 19th century, I think is quite telling.
I think another element that's quite important to all this is perhaps not so much the Vendeans themselves, but the wider royalist movement was able to be victorious, and that it essentially for quite a long time managed to more or less gain the monopoly on street presence and street violence. Really, in the grand scheme of things, the revolutionary monopoly on that, despite taking up the lion's share of the popular imagination, that was a relatively brief period compared to the ascendant royalists.
So yeah, so I'll just get to super chats and then we can get out of here. But before I do that, do you have any sort of overall concluding remarks or anything you'd like to say before we conclude this discussion?
I think I've mentioned most of what I wanted to throughout, but I think especially the men who led in the Vendée were able to even in their deaths were able to achieve a kind of heroic afterlife and did much to. So not only have we talked about how they fundamentally won in their cause overall, but for many of their family and their compatriots, they did very well, and I think it's more than most of us can hope for in death, I would say. So they're quite legendary.
Well, it's actually quite telling if you look at the art itself here between the Catelino and the Charette, is that all of these paintings are done so in a restoration style, and this isn't expansive at all. I mean, there are far more paintings of various Vendéan generals, more than you could perhaps expect reasonably from the period, given, you can say, their relative historical obscurity. And that, again, is a testament to the fact that their legacy was completely lionized. And, for good reason, the Vendéans, as usual, were the last holdouts against the imperialists during the 100 Days. And there is an argument to be made again that the war in the Vendée was the last conflict in the Napoleonic Wars as it occurred. I think the last battle of Rochefort occurred on the 21st of June, so 3 days after the Battle of Waterloo. So and 2 days after the Battle of Wavre. So yeah, there is that argument to say that it more or less begins with the Vendée in March of 1793 and ends with the Vendée. All right, thank you very much. Saint Martin for 15 Australian dollars just says thank you. Well, thank you very much, Saint Martin. Ambivalent Teacher for 7 Canadian dollars. Great stream. Do you think the existence of the Bonapartists as a political faction played a role in the weakening support for the Bourbons 1815? Undoubtedly, especially in 1814. The greatest asset to damaging the support of the Bonapartists wasn't any sort of effective propaganda by the Bourbons. It was Napoleon himself proving correctly during the 100 Days that he was a complete menace to the French people, and he brought them more pain, misery, and suffering. Not just that, he prolonged a foreign occupation that lasted throughout parts of France until 1818, most of which had been resolved by Talleyrand before Napoleon came back. And he also lost France territories during that period, in particular territories in Savoy, that Napoleon III would find a very contrived and expensive means of returning back to France, and the quote-unquote redemption of these territories, reunion of these territories in 1860. So there we are. It was a disaster. And I remember when Napoleon III does come back, he does so through a very sort of complicated and contrived series of events. So one of them is the return of Napoleon's body from St. Helena in 1840, which helps, you can say, usher in the Napoleonic myth. And I do mean myth in its purest sense, and the fact that people tend to remember the glories of the First French Empire while forgetting the economic privations and the mass casualties, and of course the legacy of total and utter defeat, and France going from a first-rate power to a second-rate power behind Austria and Russia in Europe, which should have been completely humiliating for them, but there we are. And that helped build a natural support base for someone who was already very politically active, who was Louis Napoleon, who was elected as Prince President of the Second Republic before eventually committing a self-coup in 1851 to become Emperor of the French, to be confirmed later by a plebiscite. Apostolic Majesty from Ambivalent Teacher again, thank you. Do you see the war in the Vendée as being evidence that the potential plans of the Burgundian Circle could have worked? Absolutely. That's kind of my through line. I think, again, I'm using de Tocqueville, leaning on de Tocqueville very heavily here, but the Ancien regime was basically its own worst enemy, in the sense that it provided a overly centralized system of government, which the revolutionaries could basically just capture and usurp effectively and direct towards their own ends, and in fact intensify the mission of the absolute monarchy towards Gallicanism and centralization. Whereas had France had a stronger and more cooperative identity and more of a pan-European identity, I think having a revolutionary upheaval in Paris, as we saw in the summer of 1789, would have had far less effective results, diminishing returns. Do you think that's fair to say, Rupert, if France was more decentralized?
I mean, the trouble with decentralization is that it, especially in a monarchical context, is that it's very rarely intentional. And so the presence of strong monarchs over long periods of time tends to create that movement towards centralization. And so I think you would kind of have to have an organic series of crises and setbacks for the monarchy itself in order to maintain that kind of status of relative decentralization, rather.
Indeed, that was kind of the point I was making with the whole war in the Vendée, is that this is actually one of these organic measures in terms of bringing about one of these quote-unquote natural decentralizations. Because I agree with you, decentralization historically has to be perceived of more of as an organic as opposed to a quote unquote top down measure, paradoxically. And I think the war in the Vendée demonstrates that. And yes, I think the whole basis of the centralizing mission of the French ancien regime, I don't look at it as disparagingly as someone like Fenelon would and devout faction would, simply because I see it as a justified response to the French wars of religion, which had again been symptomatic of that cause of decentralization breaking down and feudalism being a source of civil strife and revolution throughout France. So absolute monarchy effectively was a means to remedy that situation, a very imperfect means of remedying that situation. And of course, the irony is indirectly culminates in the French Revolution, but there we are. All right. That's it for the questions and the super chats. So, Rupert, is there anything you're doing or any projects you have coming up before we should leave?
Always have various writing projects on the go, but nothing to really boast of at the moment. Just, I guess, if you follow my Twitter, you might see my name around. Well, you might see things that I post. And other than that, I am moved on to the next video in my very slow, very long-running series on Greek monarchy gradually moving towards Roman monarchy. So, yeah, I'll get there eventually. I'm working on the Diadochi and the successor Hellenistic kingdoms at the moment, but can't exactly promise that will be out in the next week or anything. So,
fantastic. And of course, I'm also very invested in that topic, having made the rather heterodox view that the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were kind of proto-Byzantines, but there we are. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you very much, Rupert, for being such a stellar guest, especially as I've been flagging quite a lot recently and hopefully not too evidently during the stream. But other than that, thank you, everyone, for listening, and good night.